There is a town in Ontario where the sidewalks were poured over something that nobody wanted to name. The contractors who poured them in 1912 had been told to work fast and to ask no questions, and so they did. And the concrete went down hard over whatever had been sitting in the earth beneath Elgin Street for longer than the town itself had existed. The foreman who supervised that pour kept a journal. His grandson found it in a shoebox in 1987 and read through the entries 3 times before closing it and putting it away again. And when his daughter asked him years later what it had said, he told her only that some things are better left under concrete. That journal eventually found its way to a local historical society that has since relocated twice and whose current address is not listed publicly. Whether the journal still exists is a question nobody in the county has been willing to answer directly. This is the kind of story that gets told quietly in the older towns of this country, not in the tourist brochures, not in the heritage plaques bolted to the fronts of buildings that were built on top of things that nobody measured before they broke ground. You find these stories in the margins of county histories, in letters written by surveyors who were bothered enough to write things down but careful enough not to say too much. You find them in the notes of geologists who filed anomaly reports that got quietly reclassified and then forgotten. You find them in the oral accounts of people whose grandparents saw something during a construction project and mentioned it once at dinner and then never mentioned it again. Canada is a country with a documented history that goes back roughly 400 years in its oldest settled regions. The French were moving up the St. Lawrence in the early 1500s. The English were charting the coastlines not long after. By the 1600s, there were missions, forts, trading posts, and the beginning of the mapping project that would eventually produce the neat administrative grid we recognize today as the outline of a nation. But the land itself is older than any of that by an enormous margin. And the things in the land, the things that were already there when the first European eyes saw this country, those things did not always get recorded accurately. Sometimes they did not get recorded at all. And sometimes, which is the most interesting case of all, they got recorded once by one careful person, and then the record disappeared. What follows is not a conspiracy. It is not a fringe theory. It is a careful walk through a series of anomalies, each one documented, at least in part, by someone credentialed enough to notice, each one located beneath or adjacent to a town or city or settlement that Canadians today would recognize. These are the things that were found and then covered up, not always intentionally, not always with malice, but consistently, with a kind of institutional reluctance to sit with an uncomfortable question long enough to answer it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The eastern shore of Georgian Bay is a complicated place geologically. The Canadian Shield comes right down to the water there, ancient granite scraped clean by glaciers, fractured into 1,000 islands and channels that make navigation genuinely treacherous for people who do not know the water. The 30,000 islands, as the archipelago is sometimes called, has been inhabited for a very long time. The Anishinaabe have been there since before any written account of the region exists. The French arrived in the early 1600s and found people who had sophisticated knowledge of those channels, who knew every safe passage and every rock shelf that could split a canoe hull in a bad crossing. What the French did not record, or at least not in any document that survived in its original form, was the existence of a series of submerged stone features in the deeper channels between the islands. These features were known to the Anishinaabe guides, who led the early Jesuit missionaries through the archipelago. They were mentioned in at least one mission report, a document associated with the Jesuit relations that scholars have been unable to locate in the main archive, though a reference to it exists in a secondary source written by a Quebecois historian in the 1880s, who had apparently seen it before its disappearance from the collection. The features in question were described as stone pavements, long, flat alignments of fitted rock running along the shallow shelves of the channel floors. The depth of water over them, at the time of the French contact, would have placed them below navigable depth for a canoe, but above the level of the deepest part of the channel. They were not natural. The guide who pointed them out to the missionaries reportedly said they had been there since before memory, which is the specific phrase the historian used in his 1880s account, and which is itself a translation of something the missionary had written down from what a guide had said through an interpreter, which gives you a sense of how many layers of transmission you are dealing with here. In the 1950s, a diver named Edmund Forrester, who worked for a marine salvage company operating out of Collingwood, went down into one of the main channels near the entrance to a sheltered bay that the Anishinaabe called, in a rough English transliteration, the place where the old road goes under. Forrester was not looking for archaeological features. He was looking for a timber raft that had broken up in a storm sometime in the 1890s and whose remains the salvage company believed were still on the channel floor. He found the timbers. He also found, running perpendicular to the current underneath the timbers, a section of stone pavement roughly 6 feet wide and extending in both directions, farther than his visibility allowed him to see. Forrester told his supervisor about this. His supervisor told him to retrieve the timber and not to put anything in the dive report about stone pavements, because the salvage contract did not cover archaeological features, and reporting them would trigger a provincial review that would delay the contract. The report was filed. The timber was recovered. The stone pavement was not mentioned. 20 years later, Forrester told this story to a journalist writing a feature about Georgian Bay diving history for an outdoors magazine. The journalist included the story in a draft of the article. The draft was reviewed by an editor who removed the pavement detail on the grounds that it was unverifiable and would undermine the credibility of the rest of the piece. The article was published without it. The journalist kept his notes. When he died in 1991, his estate donated his papers to a university archive, where they sit in a box that researchers can request but that few have. The submerged stone features of Georgian Bay are not entirely unacknowledged in the academic literature. A 2003 paper published in a Canadian archaeological journal mentioned, in a single paragraph, buried in the middle of a longer analysis of woodland period site distributions around the bay, that several underwater surveys conducted in the 1990s had identified what the authors called anomalous linear stone arrangements on certain channel floors that merited further investigation. The paragraph ended there. The further investigation was not discussed. When a researcher from a different institution contacted the lead author to ask about it, the author replied that the features had been noted, but that funding for a dedicated underwater survey had not been secured, and that the paper's focus was on terrestrial sites. That paper has been cited 17 times in the literature since 2003. None of the 17 citations mention the paragraph about underwater stone arrangements. What were these features? That is the honest question, and the honest answer is that we do not know, because no systematic investigation has been conducted. But we can reason about them from what we do know about the region's geological and human history. The water level of Georgian Bay and of Lake Huron, of which it is a part, has fluctuated considerably over the past 12,000 years. At certain points during and immediately following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, the lake level was significantly lower than it is today, by as much as 100 feet in some reconstructions, though the estimates vary depending on the model used. Features that are now submerged under 10 or 15 feet of water would have been exposed land surfaces during those periods. If someone was moving through that landscape 10,000 years ago, moving through the channels and passages of what is now the Georgian Bay archipelago, but was then a very different topography of exposed rock and shallow water, they would have found certain routes easier than others. And if they were systematic people, which the archaeological record strongly suggests the inhabitants of this region were, they might have improved those routes. Laid stone, marked passage, built infrastructure at a scale modest enough to survive, but substantial enough to be found 10 millennia later by a salvage diver looking for old timber. The Anishinaabe oral tradition has a name for the beings who were here before the people who are here now. The name translates roughly as the ancient ones, or the ones who came first, and the tradition is careful to distinguish them from the ancestors of the Anishinaabe themselves. They are not the same. The ones who came first left things in the earth and in the water. The Anishinaabe knew where some of those things were. The missionaries who came in the 1600s did not particularly want to hear about them. The Trent Severn Waterway is one of the engineering achievements that Canadians tend to mention with some pride. It runs for 386 kilometres through the heart of Ontario, connecting Lake Ontario at Trenton in the east to Georgian Bay at Port Severn in the west. It uses 44 locks to move boats up and over the height of land and back down again. The Canadian government built it between 1833 and 1920, a project that consumed nearly a century of engineering effort, and that today functions as one of the country's most popular recreational boating routes. The standard account of the waterway's history says it was built to improve trade and transportation through central Ontario. It replaced a series of portage routes that Indigenous peoples and fur traders had been using for centuries. The construction crews dug canals, blasted rock, and installed lock systems in locations chosen by government engineers for their practicality and their proximity to the existing portage trails. What the standard account does not emphasize, though it does not entirely conceal it either, is that in several locations along the waterway's route, the construction crews found evidence that certain sections of the route had already been modified, not by previous colonial-era engineers, not by fur traders with shovels, by someone, at some point considerably earlier than the 19th century, who had apparently been interested in making the same passage easier. The most thoroughly documented of these discoveries was made in 1876 near the present location of the town of Bobcaygeon, in a section of the route where the canal connects two small lakes. A crew digging to widen a natural channel found, at a depth of about 8 feet below the existing ground surface, a series of flat stones that had been arranged in a way the construction foreman described in his site report as clearly intentional. The stones formed a smooth-bottomed trough, roughly 12 feet wide, running in the same direction as the natural channel. The foreman was experienced enough to recognize that this was not a natural feature. He submitted a report to the Crown Lands Office. The Crown Lands Office acknowledged receipt of the report. The construction was not paused for investigation. The stones were removed or incorporated into the canal bed, depending on which secondary account you read, and the work continued. The original report exists in the provincial archives in Toronto. It is not difficult to find. It is simply not frequently cited, because it sits in a collection devoted to 19th century public works administration, which is not a subject area that attracts many researchers whose interests run toward pre-contact archaeology. The Bobcaygeon discovery was not unique along the route. A similar feature was reported near Fenelon Falls in 1882, described in a contractor's note as a worked stone channel of considerable antiquity. Near Kirkfield, where the hydraulic lift lock was eventually installed, workers encountered what their supervisor called a strange regularity of stone arrangement in the channel floor that did not match the geology of the surrounding rock. None of these observations triggered formal investigation. All of them were noted in administrative records that have been sitting in archives for more than a century without anyone assembling them into a coherent account. The reason this matters is not simply that someone may have modified these waterways before European contact. That itself would be interesting, but perhaps not remarkable, given what we know about indigenous engineering capabilities throughout North America. The reason it matters is the scale of coordination that would have been implied. The Trent Severn route is not a single stream. It passes through a complex of interconnected lakes and rivers that required a systems-level understanding of the hydrology of central Ontario to navigate efficiently. The portage trails that fur traders used, the same trails that the waterways engineers were following, were already optimized routes through that system. The modifications found beneath the canal beds suggest that at least some sections of those routes had been physically improved, not just mapped. Who does that? Who takes a natural waterway system passing through hundreds of kilometers of Canadian shield and improves it? That is a question that requires you to assume the existence of a population larger, more organized, and more technologically capable than the archaeological consensus about this region has traditionally been comfortable acknowledging. There were people here. They were doing things. And when the 19th century construction crews came through with their blasting powder and their steam engines, they found some of what those people had left behind, noted it in paperwork, and then buried it under concrete and dressed stone. The Huron-Wendat nation, who inhabited this region of Ontario before the disruptions of the 17th century, had extensive knowledge of the waterway system. They used it for trade and travel across a territory that extended from the shores of Georgian Bay deep into the interior. Their oral traditions describe the waterway as having been used by people before them, though the nature of those earlier inhabitants is described in terms that do not map neatly onto the categories that archaeology has traditionally used. The tradition does not describe them as a separate species or a separate kind of being. It describes them as people who were here first and who were very skilled at certain things that the Huron-Wendat did not claim to have invented themselves. In 1928, an ethnographer named Harriet Rowland spent 3 months with a Huron-Wendat community near Lorette, Quebec, recording oral traditions. Her unpublished notes, which are held at a university library in Quebec City, include a passage about the waterway system that she apparently did not include in any of her published work. A historian who read those notes in the 1970s described the relevant passage as referring to modifications made to the waterways by beings described as the makers, a translation of a term that the ethnographer had struggled to render in English. The historian quoted a single sentence from Rowland's notes. "They made the water go where it needed to go, and they left the stone to prove it." That sentence has been cited exactly once in the published literature, in a footnote in a 1979 conference paper about indigenous water management practices. The paper was not widely circulated. The footnote was not followed up. Somewhere between 12 and 10,000 years ago, the Ottawa Valley was underwater, not river water, salt water. The glaciers that had been sitting on top of this part of North America for tens of thousands of years were melting, and as they melted, the land beneath them, compressed by all that weight, was still rebounding slowly upward. But the rebound was slower than the melting, and for a period of roughly 2,000 years, the low-lying areas of what is now the Street, Lawrence Lowlands and the Ottawa Valley were inundated by an arm of the Atlantic Ocean. Geologists call it the Champlain Sea. It existed. Its sediments are still there, which is how we know about it. Drive anywhere in the Ottawa region, and you are driving through what was once sea floor. The Champlain Sea retreated as the land rebounded and sea levels adjusted. By about 10,000 years ago it was gone, and the landscape it left behind was flat, fertile, and covered in the kind of fine marine sediment that eventually becomes excellent agricultural soil. It was also, on its former shorelines and shallower shelves, covered in features that the sea had organized and that subsequent inhabitants may or may not have modified. In 1963, a road crew widening the highway between Ottawa and Renfrew encountered, about 3 feet below the road surface, a section of stone that their equipment operator described to a journalist as too regular to be natural. The journalist wrote a brief item for the Ottawa Citizen. The item ran on page 14 and did not attract follow-up. The road was widened. The stone feature, whatever it was either removed or buried under the new road surface. In 1978, a water main installation project in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of Ottawa, which sits on a section of the former Champlain Sea shoreline, exposed what a municipal engineer's report described as an anomalous stone feature at a depth of approximately 6 feet. The report noted that the feature appeared to consist of flat stones, arranged in a deliberate pattern, and that it did not match the geological profile of the surrounding sediment. The report recommended that the feature be photographed and reported to the Provincial Archaeology Office before construction continued. Whether it was photographed is unclear. Whether it was reported to the Provincial Archaeology Office is also unclear. The construction continued. The water main was installed. The engineer who filed the report retired from the city in 1984 and died in 1997. His personal papers, if any, are not in any archive that has been publicly identified. The Ottawa Valley's anomalous subsurface features are, in a sense, the most intellectually interesting of all the cases in this account, for a reason that has to do with timing. The Champlain Sea was gone by 10,000 years ago. Anything beneath the former shoreline sediments that is not natural geological formation was therefore placed there before 10,000 years ago, or at most in the period immediately after the sea's retreat, when the exposed land was first becoming accessible to terrestrial inhabitants. This places any potential human modification of these features squarely in the Paleo-Indian period, or earlier, at a time when the conventional archaeological account of human presence in this part of North America is quite sparse. The conventional account says that people arrived in this region following the retreat of the glaciers, moved in from the south and southwest, and gradually colonized the landscape as it became habitable. There were certainly people here 10,000 years ago. The Plano culture, a broad tradition that archaeologists trace through stone tool assemblages, was present across much of central Canada by this period. What the conventional account is less confident about is the scale, the organization, and the capabilities of those early populations. In 1991, a geologist named Paul Serrant working on a survey of surficial deposits in Renfrew County for the Ontario Geological Survey, noted in his field log an unusual concentration of what he called possibly modified surface exposures near a section of former Champlain Sea shoreline northwest of Renfrew. Serent was not an archaeologist and explicitly noted this in his log, adding that the features would benefit from assessment by someone with relevant expertise. His field log was submitted with his survey report. The OGS survey was published in 1993 without reference to the features Serent had noted. Serent later mentioned the features in a conversation with a colleague who was an archaeologist, and the colleague reportedly expressed interest in following up but was unable to secure provincial funding for a dedicated site visit. The conversation is known because Serent mentioned it in a letter to a friend that the friend kept and that subsequently came into the possession of a small historical research group in Arnprior, Ontario, that has been collecting documentation of anomalous archaeological features in the valley since the mid-1990s. That research group has never published. Their collected materials have never been formally assessed. They exist in 3 filing cabinets in the back room of a house on the western edge of town. The Algonquin people have been in the Ottawa Valley since before any written record of the region. Their oral tradition describes the valley as a place of great age and great importance, a place where the water had once been different and where things remained in the earth from that earlier time. The specific phrase that elders have used in recorded conversations, a phrase that has been noted by several ethnographers over the past century, translates approximately as, "The valley remembers what the river forgot." What exactly the valley is understood to remember is not always specified in the accounts, but the pattern of the phrase, its recurrence across multiple recorded traditions, suggests it is tracking something specific rather than offering general metaphysical commentary. What the valley might remember, given what the geology tells us about the Champlain Sea, and given the scattered reports of anomalous subsurface features, is the existence of a populated landscape that predates the current drainage system. People living on a shoreline that no longer exists. People building things on land that is now under 12 feet of road and river sediment. People who were here long enough and numerous enough to leave behind features that a road crew, a water main installer, and a geological survey worker all noticed without quite understanding what they were seeing. The Richelieu River runs north from Lake Champlain through Quebec to the St. Lawrence. It is a beautiful river in the way that rivers, which have served as military corridors for centuries, are beautiful, which is to say that it carries a weight of history that you can feel even when the surface is calm. The French used it as an invasion route and then as a defensive line. The British used it the same way. The Americans tried to use it in 1775 and again in 1812 with uneven success. Every major colonial power that wanted to move between the interior of the continent and the St. Lawrence Basin had to reckon with the Richelieu. Before any of those colonial powers arrived, the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquin-speaking nations to the north had been disputing control of this corridor for reasons that predate any documentation we have. The river was important long before anyone wrote anything down about it, and the reasons for its importance were understood in terms that did not require a European political framework to explain. In 1615, Samuel de Champlain made his way up the Richelieu and noted several islands in the river that he described as having been fortified. He used the French word for fortified. He meant, in his colonial context, that the islands had features that served a defensive purpose, and he attributed these features to the current inhabitants of the region, the Haudenosaunee, whose military sophistication he had reason to respect after several direct encounters. But the features he described were not the wooden palisade structures that the Haudenosaunee typically used. They were stone, low stone walls running along the edges of several islands, arranged in configurations that would provide cover for defenders and restrict approach angles from the water. Champlain's description is brief and not especially analytical. He was a navigator and an administrator, not an archaeologist, and he was not particularly interested in the age of the features he observed. He noted them, attributed them to the nearest available population, and moved on. In 1903, a surveyor named Auguste Bellemare was conducting a property boundary survey for a landowner on one of the larger islands in the Richelieu between Chambly and Sorel. Bellemare's survey notes are held in a collection at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec in Montreal. In those notes, Bellemare described encountering stone wall remnants on the island's eastern shore that he estimated, based on the degree of weathering and the depth of their foundations, to be of considerable age, which he defined as probably older than the French regime. He also noted that the stones used in the walls were not native to the island. They were a type of metamorphic rock that he identified as originating from an exposure about 20 kilometers to the south. Someone had transported the stones. Bellemare raised this in his notes, but not in any official report, because his commission was to survey property boundaries, not to assess archaeological features, and he had no mechanism for doing the latter professionally. The notes sat in the archive for decades, before being identified by a researcher in the 1960s who was compiling a catalogue of pre-contact construction in the St. Lawrence Basin. That researcher included a brief reference to Bellemare's notes in a 1967 monograph on pre-contact fortifications in Quebec that was published in a limited academic edition and that does not appear in any digital database. The 1967 monograph was the last systematic academic treatment of the Richelieu Island features that this account has been able to identify. Whether the islands themselves have changed significantly since Bellemare's 1903 survey is unknown. Some of the smaller islands in the river are now uninhabited and rarely visited. Others have been developed for recreational use or have had their shorelines modified for various purposes over the 20th century. What the Bellemare notes and the Champlain observations together suggest is the existence of a pre-contact construction tradition in the Richelieu corridor that involved the transport and deliberate placement of non-local stone for defensive or strategic purposes. This is not a small claim. The transport of metamorphic stone from 20 kilometers away, across or along a river, implies not only the will to do it, but the organizational capacity to organize the labor and the technical knowledge to manage a waterborne transport operation at that scale. It implies, in short, a political entity sophisticated enough to invest in permanent infrastructure. The Haudenosaunee had sophisticated political institutions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is among the most studied examples of pre-contact political organization in North America. But the Haudenosaunee, as a rule, did not build in stone. Their construction tradition was wood, bark, and earthwork. The stone features in the Richelieu do not fit their documented construction vocabulary. Who does build in stone in this part of the continent in the pre-contact period? That is a question with complicated answers. There were stone construction traditions among certain Algonquian-speaking groups in the northeast. There were building traditions among populations that preceded both the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquian speakers in this region. Populations known to archaeology mainly through their stone tools and whose settlement patterns and capabilities are still being actively reconstructed. There is also the possibility, and this is the possibility, that the 1967 monograph considered most seriously, that the stone features in the Richelieu predate the ethnographically known populations of the region by a significant margin. The dating methodology available in 1967 was limited. The author of the monograph noted this and called for radiocarbon and thermoluminescence dating of the features. That call was not, as far as this account can determine, answered. The Richelieu Valley Mohawk community, whose traditional territory includes portions of the river corridor, has oral accounts of stone features in the river that they attribute to beings who inhabited the valley before the Haudenosaunee arrived in the region. The accounts are not detailed, they do not describe the features in engineering terms, but they consistently describe them as old, as having been there when the Haudenosaunee came south along the river, as belonging to a people whose name is given in a form that does not correspond to any other population in the recorded ethnography of the region. The Beothuk are a people who are no longer here. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanordithit, who had been living with a settler family in Notre Dame Bay since her capture in 1823, died of tuberculosis in St. John's in 1829. She was understood at the time to be the last of her nation, and subsequent research has not found reason to revise that assessment. The Beothuk, as a distinct people, had been reduced to nothing through a combination of disease, displacement, conflict, and the systematic destruction of their food sources over the course of about 200 years of European contact. What the Beothuk knew, what they had learned over the millennia of their inhabitation of Newfoundland, went with them. Some fragments were preserved through Shanordithit's conversations with the surgeon and naturalist William Epes Cormac, who genuinely tried to document what she could tell him in the months before her death. But Cormac was working in difficult circumstances, communicating across a significant language barrier with a woman who was gravely ill and who had very good reasons not to trust the people around her. What he preserved is a fragment of a fragment. In those fragments, there are references to routes through the interior of Newfoundland that Shenardithit called, in the translation Cormac worked out, the old paths. She distinguished these from the routes the Beothuk themselves used, which she described separately. The old paths were older. They ran through parts of the Newfoundland interior that the Beothuk themselves did not inhabit permanently, through boggy uplands and elevated plateaus that offered little in the way of the marine and river resources the Beothuk depended on. The old paths went to places that Shenardithit described as places where the ground is marked, a phrase that Cormac noted without much elaboration. Cormac had himself crossed the interior of Newfoundland in 1822, becoming the first European to do so on a documented journey. His account of that crossing mentions, in passing, several places where he noticed what he described as arrangements of stone that seemed unlikely to be natural. He did not know what to make of them and did not pursue the observation. He was focused on other things. But his notes from the crossing, which are more detailed than his published account, include rough sketches of two of these features, both located on high ground in the center of the island, both consisting of lines of upright stones of various sizes, running in straight alignments across the terrain. Those sketches have been part of the Cormac collection at the Newfoundland Provincial Archives for as long as the collection has existed. They have been seen by researchers working on Cormac himself, on Beothuk history, and on Newfoundland natural history. As far as this account can determine, no one has attempted to locate on the ground the features that Cormac sketched. This is partly a matter of the terrain. The interior plateau of Newfoundland is genuinely difficult country. It is boggy, trackless, and featureless at ground level in a way that makes navigation without modern equipment unreliable and travel slow and exhausting. Features that Cormac noticed from the vantage of a high ridge might not be visible at ground level from a different angle. Finding them again would require a systematic search of the plateau terrain with ground-penetrating radar or LiDAR, which has not been done. But it is also partly a matter of interest. The Beothuk are a subject of significant scholarly and public attention in Newfoundland, as the story of their destruction is a painful and important chapter in the province's history. But the attention tends to focus on the historical period of contact and on the Beothuk themselves. The question of what the Beothuk knew about things that were older than them has not been the center of attention. There is a second thread here that connects to the Beothuk in an indirect way. The maritime archaic people, who preceded the Beothuk in Newfoundland by several thousand years, had a burial and ceremonial tradition that is among the most sophisticated documented in pre-contact northeastern North America. Their burials at Port au Choix on the Great Northern Peninsula, which date to roughly 4,500 years ago, include grave goods of extraordinary care and quantity, and evidence of ritual practices that imply a rich ceremonial life and a significant investment of communal labor in commemorating the dead. They were not wandering bands of subsistence foragers. They were organized, specialized, and in some sense institutionalized people. The maritime archaic people disappeared from Newfoundland as a documented archaeological presence around 3,300 years ago. Where they went, whether they were replaced by different populations or transformed into them, is a question that the archaeology of the region has not fully answered. The Beothuk, who appear in the archaeological record roughly 1,000 years ago, may or may not be descendants of the maritime archaic. The relationship between the two populations is not clearly established. What Shenardithit's references to old paths and the ground is marked suggest, read alongside Cormac's sketches of stone alignments in the interior, is that someone, at some point before the Beothuk, was moving through the interior plateau of Newfoundland with sufficient organization and purpose to mark the terrain. The alignments Cormac sketched are too large and too regular to be accidental. Someone placed those stones. Someone maintained the routes. Someone had a reason to be in the interior of Newfoundland, an island that sits at the outer edge of the North Atlantic, in a landscape that the Beothuk themselves found marginal enough to avoid. The most likely candidates, given the chronology, are the maritime archaic. They were here, They were organized. They had the numbers and the social structure to undertake significant construction projects. And the interior of Newfoundland, bleak and hostile as it seems now, might have been a very different landscape 4,000 years ago, with different resources and different strategic significance than it has today. But we are speculating, because the evidence is thin and the people who might have been able to add to it are gone. Shenordithit died in 1829, Cormac died in 1848. The Newfoundland interior sits, largely uninvestigated, under its permanent blanket of bog and cloud, with whatever is marked on its high ground, waiting for someone to come and look. In the summer of 2019, a wildfire east of Cache Creek in British Columbia burned hot enough and long enough to strip the vegetation from several ridgelines that had not been bare within living memory. The provincial fire management teams conducting aerial surveys after the fire were looking for fuel conditions, erosion risk, and habitat damage. One of the surveyors, a woman who had been doing fire assessment work in BC for more than 15 years, noticed something in the burn scars that she described in her assessment report as anomalous terracing on the north face of a ridgeline, approximately 12 kilometers southeast of the main fire perimeter. The anomalous terracing consisted of a series of horizontal platforms cut into the side of the ridge in a pattern that the surveyor noted did not match any known logging or road construction activity in the area. The platforms were roughly even in width, perhaps 4 to 6 meters across, and they extended along the ridgeline for a distance she estimated at roughly 300 meters before the terrain changed enough to obscure the pattern. The survey report recommended that the feature be assessed by the provincial archaeology branch before any post-fire rehabilitation work was done on the slope. Whether the assessment was conducted is not clear from the public record. The BC Archaeology Branch receives hundreds of referral requests per year and has a significant backlog. The Cache Creek fire assessment was completed and filed. What happened to the recommendation about the terraced ridgeline is not recorded in any document accessible to this account. But the feature itself, the anomalous terracing on the burned ridgeline east of Cache Creek, is not an isolated case in the Fraser River drainage. The Fraser Canyon region of BC has a land use history that is as dense and as complex as any comparable area in Canada, and much of that history is only partially documented. The canyon was a major salmon fishery for thousands of years. The Nlaka'pamux and Secwepemc and Slatlimx nations have been harvesting salmon at certain points along the canyon since their oral traditions begin. The canyon has also been a major travel corridor, a route connecting the interior plateau of BC to the coast, and the people who used that corridor over thousands of years left their marks on the landscape in ways that are still being identified. The terracing tradition in BC is not unknown to archaeology. Certain elevated sites in the interior have been documented as having modified landforms associated with habitation or cultivation, and there is a growing body of research on the agricultural practices of interior Salish peoples that suggests a more deliberate manipulation of the landscape than earlier accounts acknowledged. But the scale of what the fire surveyors found east of Cache Creek does not fit comfortably within the documented record of those practices, and the location, on a north-facing ridgeline well above the river valley floor, does not correspond to the usual logic of interior agricultural site selection. The most interesting parallel for what was found on that ridgeline comes from a survey conducted in 1934 by a soil scientist named Howard Chalmers, who was working for the Federal Department of Agriculture on an assessment of the grazing potential of the interior plateau. Chalmers was not an archaeologist. He was interested in soil depth and grass cover, but he was a careful observer, and his field notes from a section of plateau between the Fraser and the Thompson rivers describe, in several locations, linear earthworks running along contour lines on ridge faces that he attributed to natural soil movement, but noted were unusually regular for a natural process. Chalmers's 1,934 field notes are held in Library and Archives Canada. They have not, to this account's knowledge, been systematically reviewed by anyone with expertise in pre-contact landscape modification since they were deposited. The 1,934 assessment in which they were submitted was about grass and soil. Nobody was reading it for archaeology. What the terraced ridgelines of the Fraser drainage represent, if they represent deliberate human construction, is a landscape management tradition of significant scale and sophistication. The modification of ridgelines for agricultural or habitation purposes in a steep canyon environment requires understanding of hydrology, erosion dynamics, and land use planning at a systems level. It requires coordinated labor. It requires continuity of knowledge over multiple generations so that the systems can be maintained. In short, it requires an organized society. The Nukapamuk's oral tradition describes the canyon landscape as having been shaped by people who came before, not by supernatural beings, though the tradition uses language that is not always easy to separate from a cosmological framework. By people who worked the land in ways that the Nlakapamuks themselves recognized as skilled and intentional. The tradition is careful to note that those earlier people were different, that they organized themselves differently, that the systems they built were built for purposes that the Nlakapamuks understood, partly, but not entirely. When the 2019 fire stripped the vegetation from that ridgeline east of Cache Creek, it was revealing something that had been there, invisible under the brush and grass, since whoever built it had last walked away. How long ago that was, nobody currently knows, because nobody has gone to look. The Cypress Hills are an anomaly in the geography of the Canadian Plains. They rise abruptly from the surrounding prairie on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, reaching elevations above 1,000 meters above sea level, which is high enough to have escaped the full depth of glaciation during the last ice age. The hills have been a refuge for plant and animal species that disappeared from the surrounding plains during the glacial maximum, and they have also been a refuge for human populations moving through or inhabiting a landscape that in its lower sections offers no shelter, no wood, and no elevation from which to observe. People have been drawn to the Cypress Hills for a very long time. The documented archaeological record of the Cypress Hills goes back roughly 10,000 years. Piikani, Siksika, Nakoda, and Cree nations all have traditions connecting them to the hills. The hills themselves are considered a place of spiritual significance across multiple traditions, a place where the world is different from how it is on the plains below, where the rules of ordinary life do not entirely apply, where things have been done that are not done elsewhere. In 1901, a Mountie named Sergeant Patrick Galway was stationed at the small detachment at Maple Creek and spent his off-duty hours hiking the hills. Galway was an educated man who had previously worked for a railway survey crew, and he had the observational habits of someone trained to notice things in terrain. In a series of letters to his brother in Ontario, he described finding, on the elevated plateau sections of the hills, a number of what he called stone corrals, by which he meant enclosures formed by upright and stacked stones arranged in rough circles or ovals, ranging in diameter from perhaps 10 feet to, in one case, what he estimated as 40 feet or more. Galway assumed these were recent structures. He assumed they had been built by the indigenous people who had inhabited the hills before the Mounties arrived, and he made no particular effort to learn whether anyone claimed to have built them. He described them in his letters as interesting curiosities, and in one letter included a rough sketch of one of the larger ones, showing a roughly oval enclosure with walls about waist height, open on one side facing east. The letters to Galway's brother are in a private collection. This account knows of them through a reference in a 1952 local history of the Maple Creek district that quoted from them at some length. The 1952 history was printed in a small edition and is not widely available, but it is held in the Saskatchewan archives and at the Maple Creek Public Library. The question of who built the Cypress Hills stone enclosures, and when, has not been definitively answered. The hills had indigenous inhabitants for thousands of years, and stone enclosures in the hills would not be architecturally surprising within that context. But the specific features that Galway described, and that were described more briefly by at least two other early observers, whose accounts the 1952 history also cited, have characteristics that distinguish them from the documented construction practices of the historically known nations in the region. The most significant distinguishing characteristic is the stone. The walls of the enclosures described by Galway and the other early observers were built from a type of quartzite that does not occur on the surface of the plateau sections of the hills. It outcrops on the lower slopes, at elevations several hundred meters below the plateau. The stones would have had to be carried up. That is possible. It has been done in many contexts by many peoples for many purposes. But it is labor-intensive, and the question of why, if one is building an enclosure in the hills, one would carry heavy quartzite up from below when there are plenty of other stones on the plateau, is not one that has been directly addressed in any account this account has found. The enclosures that Galway described also face east, or at least the ones he drew with openings were open on the east side. This is a pattern that recurs in certain ceremonial construction traditions across the northern plains, but it also appears in construction traditions that predate the historically known plains cultures by a significant margin. Whether that directional consistency in the Cypress Hills enclosures is meaningful or accidental, whether it reflects a design intention or the practical logic of blocking the prevailing wind from the west, is a question that would require systematic documentation of all the enclosures before it could be addressed. How many enclosures are there? The 1,952 local history mentioned, without citation, that local ranchers had identified at least 40 or 50 such features on the plateau sections of the hills by the mid-20th century. The Canadian archaeology literature on the Cypress Hills does not, as far as this account has found, include any systematic survey of the plateau enclosures. The Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park, which now encompasses most of the plateau, has an archaeological management plan. Whether the stone enclosures are included in that plan's inventory of heritage features is not information this account has been able to confirm. The Nakoda oral tradition about the Cypress Hills is specific about the antiquity of certain features in the hills. An elder speaking to an ethnographer in the 1940s described the stone circles on the plateau as having been placed there by the first people, a term she distinguished explicitly from the ancestors of the Nakoda themselves. The first people, she said, came to the hills before the hills had their current name, before the buffalo were numerous, before the grass grew as it grows now. This is a description of deep time. It may be metaphorical. It may also be tracking a genuine cultural memory of the hills' pre-bison period inhabitants, a population occupying the Cypress Hills in a landscape ecology quite different from the one that the historically known plains cultures inhabited. The bison-focused plains culture, the culture that archaeologists associate with the great communal hunts and the tipi rings and the portable material culture of the historic period, is a relatively recent adaptation in the long timeline of human habitation of the northern plains. It became dominant following the spread of the horse after the 17th century. Before the horse, the plains were inhabited differently by people who moved differently, relied on different resources, and left different marks on the landscape. The stone enclosures of the Cypress Hills may belong to one of those earlier chapters. Anticosti Island sits in the mouth of the St. Lawrence estuary, roughly equidistant between the north and south shores of the river at that point, though far closer to the north shore in terms of visible distance. It is a large island, roughly 8,000 square kilometers, most of it flat limestone plateau covered in boreal forest, entirely uninhabited through most of its history, and today inhabited by only a few hundred people concentrated in one small village on the western coast. Anticosti's position in the St. Lawrence makes it unavoidable for anyone moving down the river from the interior toward the Atlantic. The gulf at the mouth of the St. Lawrence was one of the great travel corridors of the pre-contact world, connecting the interior of the continent to the fishing grounds and the open ocean. Peoples moving along this corridor would have encountered Anticosti repeatedly, and there is archaeological evidence of use of the island's coast going back at least 5,000 years. In 1895, a French millionaire named Henri Meunier purchased Anticosti Island and began developing it as a private hunting reserve. The development involved construction of roads, buildings, and infrastructure across the island, and the laborers who did this work encountered, in the process of clearing the interior for access routes, features that several of them described in their own accounts. These accounts survive in fragments, in letters, and in a memoir written by a foreman named Gustave Latour, who spent 4 years on the island during the initial development phase. Latour's memoir, written after he returned to France and published in a very small edition in 1902, describes in one chapter an encounter with what he called Les Rangées, the rows, in a section of the interior plateau about 20 kilometers east of the development site. Latour and a survey crew had been laying out a route for an access road when they came upon a section of plateau where the limestone surface was interrupted by what he described as lines of upright stones, none taller than about a meter, running in parallel sets across the plateau, in a direction roughly perpendicular to the main axis of the island. The rows were evenly spaced at roughly 5 meters apart, and they extended in both the directions from the survey line until they disappeared into the forest. Latour's description is not especially detailed. He was not particularly interested in the features and did not consider them his professional concern. He noted them, considered them curious, and moved on. The access road was routed slightly to avoid one of the rows, though the memoir does not make it clear whether this was out of any respect for the feature or simply because the row made the ground difficult for the road machinery. The memoir was published in France, in a small edition, and has not, as far as this account can determine, been translated into English or French-Canadian editions. It is not in any digital database. It is not cited in any Canadian archaeological literature that this account has found. It exists as a physical book in at least one library in Paris, which is where this account's knowledge of it derives from, through a reference in a 1971 article about the history of Anticosti Island written for a Quebec geographic journal. The 1971 article mentioned Latour's account of the stone rows in a paragraph devoted to European visitors' accounts of anomalous features on Anticosti. The author of the 1971 article, a geographer named Gilles Tremblay, was primarily interested in historical land use, not in pre-contact archaeology, and he did not follow up the Latour reference with any field investigation. He noted it as one of several accounts suggesting that the island's interior had features of potential historical interest and moved on. The geology of Anticosti is relevant here. The island's interior is a flat-lying limestone plateau that has been in place for roughly 400 million years, and that is overlaid in some sections with thin glacial till and in others with exposed limestone pavement. On the limestone pavement, features constructed from local limestone would be extremely difficult to date by any standard method because the local material is old by definition and offers no useful chronometric signal. This may partly explain why the stone rows of the interior have never been formally assessed. Dating them would be very difficult, and without a date, the archaeological significance of the feature is hard to establish. But there is another way to think about the Anticosti stone rows that does not depend on dating. If you are on the island's interior plateau without modern navigation technology, in dense boreal forest with no reliable landmarks and no visible horizon in most directions, you can become lost very easily. The plateau is flat, the forest is dense, and the compass is not reliable in parts of the island because of magnetic anomalies in the underlying rock. Finding your way across the plateau requires either very detailed local knowledge or external markers. Stone rows, running in consistent directions across a plateau, are a very effective navigation aid. They are not the only possible function of such features, but they are a plausible one, and the function of a navigation marker does not require a large or highly organized population to create. A small group of people who use the island's interior regularly, and who found the navigation difficult, could have built rows like the ones Latour described over a period of years or decades, and the rows would have remained useful as navigation aids for as long as the island was being traversed by people who knew what they were. The Innu nations of the Quebec North Shore and the Labrador Peninsula have traditional connections to the St. Lawrence Gulf coast that stretch back far beyond any documentary record. Anticosti, at the mouth of the Gulf, would have been relevant to their seasonal movements, and Innu oral traditions, as far as they have been recorded, do describe the island as a place that was visited and used, though not inhabited permanently. The specific features that Latour described are not referenced in any Innu oral account that this account has been able to identify, but the absence of a reference is not the same as an absence of knowledge. Many aspects of traditional ecological knowledge and traditional landscape knowledge do not appear in the ethnographic record, either because they were never asked about or because the people who held them chose not to share them. The copper of the Great Lakes region is one of the most discussed and least resolved mysteries in North American archaeology. The numbers themselves are staggering. Archaeologists estimate that somewhere between 1.5 billion and 5 billion pounds of copper were extracted from the deposits of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Lake Superior's Ontario shore over a period beginning roughly 7,000 years ago and effectively ending around 3,000 years ago. This extraction was massive. It was industrial in scale, and it was done with stone tools and fire. The standard account says the copper was hammered cold, worked in the way that one would work native copper in its unmodified state, beaten into shapes without ever having been smelted, without ever having been heated to the point of liquefaction and poured. This is the consensus position. The copper culture of the Great Lakes was a cold working tradition. It did not smelt. But there have always been people who looked at the evidence and found the consensus position incomplete. The scale of the extraction alone raises questions. Extracting billions of pounds of copper from hard rock with stone tools in a cold climate is not a task you accomplish with a seasonal camp of 30 people making projectile points. It is a task that requires a large, organized, sustained labor force with access to food supplies sufficient to support people working underground rather than hunting or gathering. It implies a settlement pattern and a social organization that the conventional picture of the old copper culture does not fully account for. The copper processing sites near the present Ontario shore of Lake Superior, in the area between Thunder Bay and the Agawa River, have been the subject of sporadic archaeological investigation since the 19th century. In 1868, a mining engineer named Frederick Abbott, who was prospecting for copper deposits in the Lake Superior region, found, on a section of exposed rock shelf near a small river mouth, what he described in his field log as evidence of burning on a scale inconsistent with a campfire. The rock surface over an area roughly the size of a large room had been heated to a degree that had altered its color and texture. Abbott, who was professionally familiar with what fire does to rock in a mining context, wrote that the heating had been sustained, hot, and deliberate. Abbott's field log is in a collection of mining-era documents at the Thunder Bay Museum. It was referenced in a 1934 study of Lake Superior copper extraction that is itself now largely out of circulation. The 1934 study raised the possibility that the heating Abbott observed might represent a roasting operation, the application of heat to copper-bearing rock to make extraction easier. Roasting is a processing technique that, if applied to copper, would place the old copper culture in a different technological category than the one the consensus account assigns it to. The 1934 suggestion was not followed up in any sustained way. The consensus that emerged from the mid-20th century archaeological literature assigned cold working to the Great Lakes copper culture and moved on. Later researchers who raised questions about the technology were working against an established consensus, which is always difficult. In 1992, a materials scientist at a Canadian university who had been studying historical metallurgy as a hobby spent 3 weeks examining copper artifacts from several Canadian museum collections. He was looking at the microstructure of the copper, which can indicate whether the metal has been heated above a certain threshold during processing. Several of the artifacts he examined showed microstructural patterns that he believed were inconsistent with pure cold working, patterns that suggested the copper had at some point been annealed, heated, and slowly cooled, a process that requires fire and some understanding of heat management, but that does not necessarily require full smelting. The materials scientist wrote up his observations in a paper that he submitted to a Canadian archaeology journal. The paper was reviewed and rejected on the grounds that his methodology was outside the expertise of the archaeology reviewers, and that his interpretation of the microstructural evidence was not supported by citations from the relevant literature. He did not resubmit. The paper was not published. He shared it with 3 colleagues, 2 of whom expressed interest, and 1 of whom told him directly that publishing it would create professional difficulties. Whether the Laurentian Shield copper processing tradition involved heat is a question that could, in principle, be answered by systematic materials analysis of the large museum collections of Great Lakes copper artifacts. The technology to do this analysis exists. The museum collections exist. The question is whether the institutional will to pursue an answer that might complicate the consensus exists, and that is a different kind of question. The Ojibwe oral tradition about the Lake Superior copper is one of the richest bodies of knowledge about the material in existence. The copper was sacred. It was the property of the underwater panther, Mishibijii, the great creature who lived in the lake's depths and from whom the copper was understood to come. Working copper was not merely a craft, it was a negotiation with a supernatural power. The protocols for extracting, working, and using copper were embedded in a ceremonial framework that made the material inseparable from its spiritual context. What those protocols included, in their technical specifics, is not always recorded in the ethnographic literature. Ethnographers recording Ojibwe copper traditions tended to focus on the ceremonial and spiritual dimensions because that was what fit their analytical frameworks. The technical knowledge, the specific procedures for working the material, was not always a subject of direct inquiry. An elder who knew how to manage a heated copper rock face and an elder who knew the ceremonial relationship with Mishibiji might have been the same person, and the interviewer who sat with that person in 1910 or 1920 or 1930 might have recorded the ceremony and missed the metallurgy entirely. The oil sands of northern Alberta have been described, in the language of industrial development, as a resource deposit. They have also been described by people whose relationship to the land runs in a different direction as a landscape. The distinction matters because a resource deposit is a thing you extract from, and a landscape is a thing you read. Before the industrial development of the Athabasca oil sands began in earnest in the late 20th century, the landscape of the Athabasca region was known to the Cree and Dene peoples of the area as a place of great complexity. The tar that seeped from the riverbanks was known and used. It was a waterproofing agent, a caulk for canoes, a material with practical applications that the people who lived here had been using for a long time. The Cree called the place Athabasca, a name that refers to the reedy shallows at the mouth of the river, and they knew it as a place where the earth itself was different, where the ground was not entirely reliable in the way that solid ground is, where the boundaries between what is above and what is below were less distinct than elsewhere. The construction of extraction infrastructure in the Athabasca region, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating dramatically from the 1990s onward, required the removal of enormous quantities of overburden, the soil and sediment and material sitting above the oil sands deposits. This removal, conducted at a scale and pace that had no precedent in the region's history, exposed sections of subsurface terrain that had not been visible, in some cases, for a very long time. In 2004, a heavy equipment operator named Darren Chouinard, who was working on an overburden removal project for one of the major extraction companies in the Athabasca region, encountered, roughly 3 meters below the original surface level, a section of stone arrangement that he stopped his machine to examine. Chouinard was an experienced operator who had been working in the oil sands for 11 years. He had seen various things come up during overburden removal: glacial erratics, tree stumps, occasional bone, and he had a reasonably calibrated sense of what was unusual. What he was looking at, he told his supervisor, was unusual. The feature was a section of fitted stones, flat-sided pieces of a local sandstone that had been placed in what he described as a deliberate layered arrangement, not naturally deposited, not randomly arranged, but fitted together in a way that implied someone had chosen each piece for its place. The feature extended about 4 meters in the direction his machine had been traveling, and was of unknown length in the other direction, since the overburden on either side had not yet been removed. Chouinard's supervisor came to look. The supervisor agreed that the feature appeared unusual. He called the site archaeologist, a consulting archaeologist employed by the extraction company, who came to examine the feature later that afternoon. The site archaeologist photographed the feature, measured its dimensions, and wrote a preliminary assessment. She noted in that assessment that the feature appeared to be of possible anthropogenic origin and recommended that extraction in the immediate area be paused while the assessment was completed. The extraction was not paused. The site archaeologist was informed that the production schedule did not allow for an extended pause and that she should complete her assessment as quickly as possible. She completed the assessment within 48 hours. In the completed assessment, the feature was described as a natural geological formation, specifically as a section of fractured sandstone that had been displaced and reoriented by glacial action, producing an apparently regular arrangement that was in fact the result of natural processes. Chouinard did not believe this characterization was accurate. He said so to a colleague. The colleague later mentioned the incident to a journalist who was writing a longer story about indigenous land rights in the oil sands region. The journalist's story was published in 2007 and included a brief reference to the Chouinard incident attributed to an anonymous source. The extraction company's communications team did not respond to the journalist's inquiry about the specific feature. What the feature actually was is now unknowable. The overburden removal continued. The section of terrain where the feature was found is now part of an extraction area that has been completely restructured at the surface level. The stones, if they were what Chouinard believed them to be, are gone. The Athabasca region's pre-contact human history extends further back than the oil sands development's institutional memory tends to acknowledge. The Cree and Dene populations were present in the region when the first European explorers arrived in the late 18th century. Before that, the region was used and traversed by populations whose identities and cultures are not fully documented, but whose presence in the landscape left traces, some of which are now being removed, processed, and disposed of as overburden at a rate that archaeological monitoring cannot keep pace with. The Archaeological Society of Alberta has published periodic reports on the challenges of archaeological monitoring in the oil sands development zone. Those reports document the difficulty of the task without, for obvious reasons, being specific about what is being missed. The scale of overburden removal in the Athabasca region over the past 3 decades has been genuinely enormous. What has been lost in that process is, by definition, not fully known. At some point in this account, it is worth stepping back and looking at the pattern itself, rather than at individual cases. Each of the situations described so far shares certain features. There is a discovery, made by someone in the course of ordinary work, of something that does not fit the expected picture of the landscape. There is a report, filed by someone conscientious enough to put it in writing. There is a response that acknowledges the report but does not pursue its implications. And then there is silence. Not always the silence of suppression or conspiracy, often just the silence of institutional priorities that do not include the uncomfortable question. What makes this pattern worth examining is its consistency. It appears across provinces and across time periods. It appears in mining company records, in railway survey notes, in municipal construction files, in provincial geology reports. The specific details vary, but the shape is always the same. Something found, something noted, something not followed up. Why does this happen? The most charitable and most accurate explanation is the simplest one. The people who make these discoveries are not archaeologists. They are engineers, surveyors, construction workers, and drillers. They are doing something else, something with a deadline and a budget and a clear operational objective. They notice the anomalous thing, they report it if they have the time and the inclination, and then they continue with what they were being paid to do. The anomalous thing is not their problem. The people to whom the reports are sent, the supervisors, and the government offices, and the contracting agencies, also have operational priorities. They are managing projects, not investigating archaeology. The mechanism by which an anomalous stone feature in a construction report becomes a subject of sustained archaeological investigation requires a series of institutional handoffs that in practice rarely all work. The construction report has to reach someone who recognizes its potential significance. That person has to have a channel through which to refer it to a qualified archaeologist. The archaeologist has to have funding and time to follow up. The follow-up has to produce results that justify publication. The publication has to reach the community of researchers who would find it significant. This chain has many weak links, and the chain breaks, consistently, at one link or another. None of this requires malice. None of this requires a conspiracy to suppress evidence of pre-contact civilization. The silence is produced not by an active decision to conceal, but by the aggregate effect of 1,000 small decisions made by people focused on other things. The geologist who reclassified Serrant's field notes about the Ottawa Valley features probably believed the natural formation explanation was accurate. The site archaeologist who described Chouinard's Athabasca feature as glacially displaced sandstone may have genuinely believed that interpretation. The editor who removed the Georgian Bay pavement story from the magazine article was making a professional judgment about verifiability that was not unreasonable on its face. But the aggregate effect of all these individually reasonable decisions is a systematic gap in the record. The features that fit the expected picture get documented. The features that complicate it tend not to. Over a century of this process, a very large number of anomalous observations have been made, noted briefly, and then absorbed into the archive of things that nobody has gotten around to investigating. The second explanation, which operates alongside the first and is not in contradiction with it, involves the intellectual frameworks through which the pre-contact past of this country has been understood. The dominant framework in North American archaeology through most of the 20th century was one that understood indigenous populations as relatively small, relatively mobile, and relatively non-intensive in their land use. This framework was not developed in bad faith. It was based on the archaeological evidence available at the time, and the evidence genuinely supported a picture of small band hunting and gathering cultures with limited population density and limited landscape modification. The problem is that this framework became self-reinforcing. Features that fit the picture of small band hunting cultures were documented and interpreted within that framework. Features that suggested larger populations, greater organization, or more intensive landscape modification were interpreted in ways that minimized their implications, attributed to natural processes, or simply not followed up. The framework shaped which questions were asked and which observations were pursued. And the questions that were not asked, the observations that were not pursued, disappeared into the archive of things nobody looked at. The past 2 decades have substantially complicated this picture. LiDAR surveys, which can penetrate forest canopy and reveal ground-level features invisible from above, have found earthworks, field systems, village complexes, and road networks across North America that were not visible through conventional survey methods. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed migration patterns and population sizes that complicate the earlier models. Paleolimnological studies, which look at the chemical record preserved in lake sediments, have documented agricultural activity and landscape disturbance at scales and in time periods that the conventional framework did not predict. The picture of pre-contact North America that is emerging from this new evidence is larger, denser, and more complex than the picture that dominated the 20th century. What this means for the anomalous features documented in this account is not that they are necessarily what the most optimistic interpretation would suggest. It means that the automatic dismissal of such features, the easy attribution to natural processes or to misidentification, is no longer as intellectually defensible as it once was. The landscape of pre-contact Canada contained more than the 20th century framework predicted. Some of what was found and then not investigated may have been genuinely significant. It is worth returning now to something specific, because the pattern of institutional silence is most visible when you look at what is sitting immediately beneath the oldest parts of Canadian towns. Kingston, Ontario, is one of the oldest continuously occupied urban sites in Canada. Fort Frontenac was established at the head of the St. Lawrence in 1673. Before that, there was a Haudenosaunee village that the French described in their records. Before that, the site had been occupied, according to the archaeological evidence, for thousands of years. The location makes immediate practical sense. It sits where the St. Lawrence begins, at the outlet of Lake Ontario, controlling movement between the Great Lakes system and the river route to the ocean. Anyone who understood the continent's hydrology and needed to control it would choose this location. In 1964, during the construction of a parking structure on the western edge of what was then the downtown core, workers excavating the foundation hole encountered, at a depth of roughly 8 feet below street level, a section of worked stone that the construction foreman later described to a local historian as looking like a floor. Not a natural rock exposure, a floor. Flat stones fitted together horizontally, extending across the full width of the excavation area, which was approximately 20 feet at that point. The construction company contacted the local historical society, which at that time did not have the resources or expertise to conduct a rapid archaeological assessment. The local historical society contacted Queen's University, which had an archaeology department. The archaeology department was interested, but could not mobilize a response team on the timeline the construction project required. The foundation was poured. The parking structure was built. The stone floor, whatever it was, is now under several feet of concrete. This incident is documented in a letter from the Historical Society director to the archaeology department head, a letter that is in the Queen's University archives, and in a brief mention in the local Historical Society's annual report for 1964. It has not, to this account's knowledge, been cited in any academic publication about the pre-contact history of the Kingston area. What was the stone floor? The most conservative explanation is that it was a section of the French period fort's foundation or infrastructure, which would make it historically significant but not pre-contact. The French did build in stone at Fort Frontenac. However, The depth at which the feature was found, 8 feet below a street level that has been built up significantly over centuries, pushes the date of deposition back. French period stone construction at Fort Frontenac would not typically be expected at that depth at that location. It does not rule out the French explanation, but it does complicate it. The other explanation is pre-contact, which places the stone floor within the long occupation record of the site and raises the question of which occupation phase it belongs to. The Haudenosaunee village, documented by the French in the 17th century, did not, as far as the record shows, build in stone. Earlier occupations of the site, stretching back several thousand years, are less well characterized. Whether any of those earlier populations built horizontal stone surfaces in the Kingston area is not documented. Move west along the lake to Toronto. The area that is now Toronto's downtown core sits on a flat lake terrace that offered easy access to the lake, several navigable river mouths, and reliable fresh water. It has been inhabited for something like 12 to 13,000 years, since the glacial lake that preceded Lake Ontario dropped to roughly its current level. The Wendat Nation had settlements in the area before European contact. The French established a trading post and fort. The English established York. Toronto grew over all of it. The construction history of downtown Toronto is a record of continual subsurface encounters with earlier layers. The city has an extensive archaeological management regime that has been in place since the 1970s, and by international standards, it is reasonably well administered. But the scale of the downtown core's subsurface archaeology and the speed of development means that monitoring is always catching up. In 1998, during excavation for a condominium tower in the King Spadina district, workers found a stone feature at approximately 5 feet below street level that a monitoring archaeologist described in a site report as possibly of pre-contact origin. The feature was photographed. The photographs are in a site report filed with the Provincial Archaeology Office. The site report is not publicly accessible in digital form. The condominium was built. The feature was not further investigated. This is not unusual in the Toronto archaeological monitoring system. It is, in fact, more or less normal. Discoveries are made, recorded minimally, and development continues. The recording creates an archive of what was found. The archive grows. The investigation of what the archive means is perpetually deferred. Halifax, Nova Scotia presents a different case. Halifax is built on a peninsula that was used by the Mi'kmaq for a very long time before the British established the naval base there in 1749. The city sits on a glacially rounded granite landform with excellent natural harbouring conditions. The Mi'kmaq called the area Kchipuktuk, meaning Great Harbour, a name that encodes exactly the practical geography that made it attractive to every subsequent occupant. The granite bedrock of Halifax provides very little in the way of sediment layers that would preserve pre-contact features. What the geology does not destroy, the construction of a major naval and commercial port over 2.5 centuries tends to eliminate. Halifax is, archaeologically speaking, a very difficult site, but there are places in Halifax where the record is less entirely erased. On the Dartmouth side of the harbour, where the geological conditions are slightly different and the construction history is less intensive, several residential construction projects in the 1970s and 1980s produced reports of stone features at moderate depth. A 1,977 house foundation excavation produced what the homeowner, who happened to have a background in geology, described in a letter to the Nova Scotia Museum as a clearly artificial stone arrangement at a depth of about 3 feet. The Nova Scotia Museum acknowledged the letter. A field visit was scheduled and then postponed. There is no record of the field visit having taken place. There is a way of reading landscape that most people who grew up in cities do not have, but that was once universal. When you learn to read landscape, you understand that the surface of the ground is a record. It records every time it was modified, every time it was loaded, every time something was built on it or removed from it or moved across it repeatedly. The record is written in topography, in soil variation, in the patterns of vegetation that respond to what is below the surface. Reading it requires practice and patience and a willingness to look at ordinary seeming ground with the question in mind: what happened here? The people who had this skill in its most developed form were the people who had been reading particular landscapes for a long time. Indigenous peoples across Canada had developed, over thousands of years of continuous occupation, an intimate knowledge of their territories that included the ability to read signs in the landscape that European observers did not have the framework to interpret. When an Anishinaabe elder looked at a section of ground near Georgian Bay and said the water road used to go through there, she was reading the landscape in a way that the missionary walking beside her was not equipped to read. The missionary wrote down what she said. Then he wrote about something else. The particular kind of landscape reading that is most relevant to this account is the ability to identify subtle, topographic anomalies, places where the ground is not entirely what it appears to be at the surface. A slight raised platform where none should be, a linear depression that follows a straight line for too long to be a natural drainage feature, a section of terrain where the vegetation grows differently because the soil below is different from what surrounds it, because something is there or was once there that altered the soil chemistry or structure. These features are visible from the ground to someone who knows what to look for. They are also, increasingly, visible from the air. LiDAR surveys, which use laser pulses fired from aircraft to build precise three-dimensional maps of ground surfaces, even through tree canopy, have transformed the ability to identify subtle topographic anomalies across large areas. LiDAR has found thousands of previously unknown archaeological features across North America in the past 15 years, features that were there all along, invisible to conventional survey, but perfectly apparent to the right technology. The province of British Columbia has an extensive LiDAR database developed primarily for forestry management purposes. Researchers who have access to that data have found, in recent years, features in the forest interior that do not fit natural formation processes, linear ridges that are too straight, cleared areas that are too regular, what appear to be terraced formations in contexts not previously associated with agricultural modification. Some of these findings have been published. Many have been noted in internal reports and not yet published. Ontario has conducted LiDAR surveys of various portions of the province for various purposes. The full dataset is not uniformly accessible to researchers, and the analysis of the data for archaeological purposes has been uneven. In areas where the data has been analysed carefully, there have been findings of interest. A 2019 provincial report on a section of the Trent River watershed noted LiDAR anomalies consistent with possible linear earthworks in two locations that had not been previously identified as archaeological sites. The report recommended ground truthing, which is the process of physically visiting a location to confirm what the remote sensing data suggests. The ground truthing had not been conducted as of the most recent information available to this account. In Quebec, the archaeological LiDAR analysis program is less developed than in some other provinces, partly because of the density of forest cover in much of the province's territory, and partly because of the way archaeological management is organized in the province. The St. Lawrence lowlands and the Laurentian foothills, which have the highest density of pre-contact use documented by conventional archaeology, have also had the most development pressure, which means that features that might have been identified by LiDAR survey have in some cases already been built over. In the Atlantic provinces, LiDAR-based archaeological survey has been conducted in limited areas, primarily in the context of specific development projects. The coast of Nova Scotia, with its Mi'kmaq archaeological heritage and its complex of glacially modified landforms, would be a natural candidate for systematic survey. Whether that survey will be conducted depends on funding priorities that are outside the scope of this account to predict. What LiDAR has already shown, in the areas where it has been applied to archaeological questions in Canada, is that the density of pre-contact sites and features in many regions is significantly higher than conventional survey had estimated. This is consistent with what LiDAR has shown everywhere it has been applied. The pre-contact world was more thickly inhabited, more extensively modified, and more complex than the picture built from conventional survey methods suggested. If you take that correction factor, the systematic undercounting that conventional survey methods produced, and apply it to the anomalous features documented in this account, a different picture begins to emerge. The features that showed up in construction reports and survey notes and personal letters over the past century and a half were not unusual flukes in a largely empty landscape. They were the visible tips of a much denser distribution of features that mostly went unnoticed because nobody was looking for them with the right tools and the right questions. Canada is not an empty country with a thin pre-contact history. It is a country with one of the richest and longest pre-contact histories on Earth, a history that extends back to the very edge of the habitable period after the glacial retreat, and in some coastal and southern areas perhaps beyond it. The landscape of Canada is a document written in stone and sediment, and soil chemistry and subtle topographic variation over thousands of years. Most of that document has not been read. What has been read selectively, through frameworks that directed attention towards certain things and away from others. The things that got noticed and then not investigated are part of what the full document would say if anyone were reading it systematically. They are data points in a much larger account that has not been assembled, because the will, the funding, and the institutional frameworks that would be needed to assemble it have not been consistently available. Before writing, there was speaking. Before maps, there were stories. The idea that oral tradition is an unreliable vehicle for historical information is one of the assumptions of European scholarly culture that has been most substantially revised in recent decades. It turns out that oral traditions, under the right conditions, can preserve accurate information over extraordinarily long periods of time, periods measured not in generations but in millennia. The most striking documented example involves Aboriginal Australian traditions about the flooding of coastlines that occurred as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. A 2015 study examined a collection of oral traditions from coastal Aboriginal groups that described landscapes now submerged beneath the sea. The researchers were able to match the descriptions to specific submerged features identified through marine survey and the dates of the flooding, determined by geological reconstruction, placed the events described in the oral traditions between about 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. The traditions were tracking events that had occurred when the current coastlines did not exist. That is not a unique finding. Similar analyses have been conducted with oral traditions from other parts of the world and have produced similar results. The conditions under which oral tradition preserves information accurately over very long periods are not mysterious. They involve social mechanisms for correcting error, typically through collective recitation and community verification. They involve embedding important information in memorable narrative or ritual frames, and they involve social structures that value and reward accurate transmission. Many Indigenous cultures of Canada had highly developed oral tradition systems that met all these conditions. The knowledge preserved in those systems covers, among many other things, information about the landscape, including information about features of the landscape that are no longer where they were, features that have been built over, or flooded, or eroded, or changed by the same processes of geological and ecological change that have been reshaping this landscape for thousands of years. When an Anishinaabe elder says that certain things were done in a certain place before her people came to that place, she is transmitting information through a system that has been preserving accurate information for a very long time. The specific claim she is making, that there were people and activities and features in a landscape before the current inhabitants arrived, is a claim about temporal sequence. It is exactly the kind of claim that oral tradition is good at preserving, because it is a claim about when things happened relative to each other, not about precise dates or specific quantities, but about the order of events and the nature of what was found. The Haudenosaunee oral traditions about their movement into the St. Lawrence Valley in the centuries before European contact include descriptions of encountering features in the landscape that they did not build, cleared areas, worked stone, paths that went somewhere specific. The Haudenosaunee were new to the valley, at least in the sense that they had moved into it relatively recently, and they were finding evidence of prior occupation. This is consistent with the archaeological record, which documents a long sequence of occupation in the St. Lawrence Valley preceding the historically known Haudenosaunee presence. The Mi'kmaq traditions about the maritime coast include accounts of features along the coast and in the interior that the Mi'kmaq distinguish from the works of their own ancestors. These features are described as older, as belonging to a different chapter, as being in place when the Mi'kmaq themselves came to inhabit the territory. The specific nature of the features is not always described in detail in the recorded accounts, but the consistent pattern is one of temporal layering of a landscape that already had things in it when the current inhabitants arrived. The Inuit traditions of the Eastern Arctic include an elaborate body of knowledge about the Kalunat, a term that in historical usage referred to European-descended people, but that in the oldest recorded uses referred to something different, to people who had been in the Arctic before the Inuit. The Dorset culture, which preceded the Inuit in the eastern Arctic and which the Inuit displaced roughly 800 years ago, is known from archaeology as a sophisticated and widespread culture that had been in the Arctic for nearly 3,000 years. The Inuit oral traditions about the Dorset, whom they sometimes called Tunit or Sivulimut, preserve information about their physical characteristics, their construction practices, and their departure that is surprisingly consistent with what the archaeology independently suggests. This is a very important point. The Inuit tradition about the Dorset is a case where the oral tradition can be tested against an independent archaeological record, and where the test shows that the tradition is tracking something real. This is not a guarantee that all oral traditions are equally accurate, but it is evidence that the transmission systems of these cultures are capable of preserving substantive information over the relevant timescales. What this means for the anomalous features documented elsewhere in this account is that when an elder says there were things in the landscape before her people, she may well be right. The mechanisms by which that information has been preserved are real. The time depth over which those mechanisms operate is real. The appropriate response is not to dismiss the information as myth or legend, but to treat it as a data point that can be cross-referenced against other evidence, exactly as the Inuit tradition about the Dorset can be cross-referenced against the archaeological record. The knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples of Canada about the pre-contact landscape of this country represent one of the most valuable and least utilized bodies of information available to anyone trying to understand what was here before the concrete went down. They are not easily accessed, partly because they are held by communities that have good historical reasons not to share everything they know with institutions that have not always treated them well, and partly because the academic frameworks for integrating traditional knowledge with archaeological evidence are still being developed. But they are there, and they are not silent. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the mouth of the St. Lawrence for the first time. He had charts of the coast, made by fishermen who had been working the Grand Banks for decades, but no charts of the interior. He was going into unmapped territory, which is to say he was going into territory that had not been mapped by Europeans. It had been mapped in other ways. It was carried, in every navigable detail, in the minds of the people who lived there. The maps that Cartier and those who followed him made of the St. Lawrence Basin over the subsequent decades were built almost entirely on indigenous knowledge. The locations of rivers, the positions of portages, the depths of channels, the positions of falls and rapids, the locations of villages and the trails connecting them. All of this came from indigenous sources, filtered through translation and colonial interpretation and the cartographic conventions of the period. What the maps left out is not random. The things that got left out of the early European cartography of Canada tend to cluster in certain categories. Subsurface features, obviously, since maps represent surfaces. Features in the interior that were not relevant to the trade routes and military corridors, the French and British were primarily interested in mapping. Features that were described by indigenous informants in terms that the European cartographers did not have categories for, and features that the indigenous informants chose not to describe for their own reasons. This last category is worth dwelling on. The relationship between indigenous peoples and the Europeans who came with ships and charts and trade goods in the 16th and 17th centuries was not a relationship of openness and full disclosure on either side. The indigenous nations of the St. Lawrence, the coast, and the Great Lakes Basin were sophisticated political actors who understood what information was valuable and who made decisions about what to share and what to withhold. They had been doing this long before Europeans arrived in their dealings with each other. They continued doing it when the Europeans came. Some of the things they chose not to share with the Europeans were practical, specific routes that gave strategic advantage, the locations of resource deposits that they wanted to protect, social and ceremonial knowledge that was none of the Europeans' business. But some of what they chose not to share was something more specific, the knowledge of places that were, in their framework, not safe to point out to outsiders. This is a recurring pattern in the ethnographic literature, though it is more often noted in passing than analysed directly. There are places in the Canadian landscape, documented across multiple cultural traditions, that are understood to be powerful in ways that require care and protocol. These places are known to the communities whose territory they are in. They are managed through practice and knowledge and ceremony. They are not universally announced to visitors. The early European missionaries and traders were not, on the whole, people whose relationship to landscape acknowledged the kinds of power that indigenous traditions recognized. They were people whose cosmological framework did not include the possibility that a specific piece of ground could have a quality of danger or sacredness that required special handling. When an indigenous guide declined to take a missionary to a particular place, the missionary interpreted this as superstition or obstruction, not as the exercise of a knowledge system that had been managing that landscape appropriately for thousands of years. What is in those places? The honest answer is that this account does not know, because this account cannot access the information that was managed through those traditions, information that was partly withheld from European recorders for good reasons, and that has been partly lost through the destruction of the communities and knowledge systems that held it. But the places themselves still exist, in many cases, and some of them have physical features documented by the scattered observers who found them accidentally over the past century and a half, that suggest they were not simply ceremonially significant, but practically constructed. The convergence between places that indigenous traditions mark as powerful or requiring care, and places where anomalous physical features have been found by construction crews and surveyors, is not perfect and not systematic, because the systematic comparison has not been done. But in several cases in this account, the specific locations where anomalous features were reported correspond to locations that appear in the ethnographic literature as places of significance in indigenous traditions. The Georgian Bay channels, where the submerged pavement was found, are in the area of what the Anishinaabe called the place where the old road goes under. The elevated sections of the Cypress Hills where Galway described stone enclosures are in areas that Nakota tradition identifies as places where the old ones worked. The Richelieu Valley features are in a corridor that the Haudenosaunee traditions describe as having been inhabited by people who came before. These correspondences may be coincidental. They may reflect the simple fact that features built in landscape positions that are practically significant, on routes, on high ground, near water, tend to be both physically detectable and recognized by local traditions as significant for the same practical reasons. But they may also reflect something more direct, the knowledge systems of the contemporary indigenous nations retaining, in attenuated but recognizable form, some information about the features that are there. Quebec City is the oldest continuously occupied urban site in Canada that is still recognizably itself. It has been sitting on its promontory above the St. Lawrence since the early 1600s, and in the centuries before that, it was occupied by the Wendat town of Stadacona, which Cartier visited in 1534 and found substantial and well populated. The site has the geological advantage of the Cap Diamant, the dramatic clifftop position that made it the most defensible natural position in the St. Lawrence Basin, and this has meant that it has been continuously fortified, continuously built over, and continuously excavated in the sense that every major construction project in its centuries-long urban history has gone down into whatever was there before. The archaeology of Old Quebec has been conducted with increasing rigor since the 1970s, and the record it has accumulated is dense and detailed. The Wendat occupation of the site before French contact is documented. The French colonial layers are documented in fine detail. What is less fully documented, or more precisely what is documented but not always prominently discussed, is what was there before the Wendat. In 1972, a major construction project in the lower town near the site of Place Royale encountered a section of stone wall at a depth significantly below the French period strata. The wall was not the first pre-French contact feature found in Quebec City, but it was the most substantial, and it had characteristics that the archaeologists who examined it found difficult to place in the known cultural sequence of the region. It was built of local limestone but was bonded in a manner that did not match the construction practices of any population documented in the pre-contact record for the area. The stones were fitted, and the joints were tight in a way that was unusual. The 1972 discovery was assessed by two archaeologists from a Quebec university who published a brief report in a provincial archaeology bulletin. The report described the wall, noted its anomalous characteristics, proposed two possible explanations. one attributing it to an unknown period of the Wendat occupation, and one noting that it could not be attributed to any known population, and recommended further investigation. The further investigation did not occur because the construction project continued on its timeline, and the wall was incorporated into the new structure's foundation. The 1972 bulletin is not widely cited. The Place Royale archaeological sequence is well documented in the literature, and the 1972 wall appears in some discussions of the site as an anomalous early feature without generating much analytical attention. Whether the further investigation that was recommended has ever been conducted, even partly through documentary or archival means rather than physical excavation, is not something this account has been able to determine. What the Quebec City wall suggests, if it was indeed of pre-contact and pre-Wendat origin, is the existence of a stone construction tradition in the lower street, Lawrence Valley, that predates the historically known populations of the region. This is consistent with what the Richelieu Valley evidence suggests, and it is consistent with the general picture that is emerging from various corners of the street. Lawrence Basin, of a pre-contact landscape that was more densely inhabited and more architecturally complex than the conventional account has acknowledged. The Wendat, who inhabited the Quebec City area at the time of French contact, had their own oral traditions about the people who had been there before them. These traditions distinguished, as traditions in this region consistently do, between the Wendat's own ancestors and an earlier population whose nature is described in terms that vary depending on the source. They were bigger, they built differently, they knew things that the Wendat did not. The traditions were recorded in fragmentary form by the Jesuit missionaries who had the most sustained contact with the Wendat, but the Jesuits were not primarily interested in what the Wendat knew about pre-Wendat populations. They were interested in what the Wendat believed about the nature of the world and the soul, which was the information relevant to their mission. The archaeology passed through their records unremarked. There is one Jesuit document that is an exception, a 1638 letter from a missionary at a Wendat mission near Georgian Bay, included in the relations for that year, describes a conversation with a Wendat elder who took him to a place in the landscape and showed him what the missionary described as a very ancient construction of stone, which the elder told him had been built by people whose name I cannot write in this language because it has no equivalent letters. The missionary described the construction as consisting of stones placed deliberately on a ridge in a manner suggesting walls, though much collapsed and overgrown. He noted its location approximately, but did not revisit it, and did not describe it more fully. The location described by the missionary has been identified by a researcher who examined the relations in the 1990s as being roughly consistent with a section of Georgian Bay shoreline in the area of the Bruce Peninsula. Whether the feature that Jesuit missionaries saw in 1638 is the same kind of feature that Edmund Forrester found while diving in the Georgian Bay channels in the 1950s is not established. But they were in the same general territory, and they were both described by their observers as deliberate constructions of uncertain antiquity. That is probably not nothing. In 2007, a team of researchers from the University of Michigan and the University of Michigan Dearborn published a paper in the Journal of Paleolimnology that described an astonishing discovery made during a sonar survey of the floor of northern Lake Huron. They had found, at a depth of about 30 meters, a series of features on the lake floor that were inconsistent with natural geological processes. Specifically, they had found what appeared to be stone structures, linear arrangements of boulders and cobbles, running along the lake bottom in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. The features were located in the Alpena Amberley Ridge area, a submerged ridge that connects the present Michigan and Ontario shorelines. This ridge was above water during the last ice age, when lake levels were significantly lower, and it would have been a land route across what is now open water, connecting the two sides of the lake. Animals crossing the ridge in large numbers, as they apparently did, would have moved predictably along its highest sections. Hunters who knew this would have found those sections excellent places to intercept prey. The researchers proposed that the stone features were hunting structures built by Paleo-Indian or early archaic hunters who were using the ridge to intercept caribou and other animals during their migrations across the exposed ridge surface. The structures, in this interpretation, were drive lines and hunting blinds, arrangements of stone designed to channel animal movement and conceal waiting hunters. The features dated, based on the geological reconstruction of the ridge's submergence history, to at least 10,000 years ago and potentially older. This paper attracted significant attention when it was published, and a follow-up diving program explored the features in more detail over the subsequent years. The hunting structure interpretation was broadly accepted by the archaeological community as plausible and supported by the available evidence. A 2022 publication reported the identification of a specific V-shaped stone structure with a hunting blind at its apex that the authors argued was an excellent example of the kind of communal hunting infrastructure documented ethnographically in many boreal and subarctic cultures. The Lake Huron underwater discoveries are notable in this account, not primarily for what they found, which is well documented in the published literature, but for what they imply about the density of underwater features in Canadian waters more generally. If a sonar survey of one section of Lake Huron's floor found substantial stone structures of pre-contact origin, the inference that other sections of the lake and other lake floors in the Great Lakes system contain comparable or related features is not unreasonable. Lake Huron is approximately 332 kilometers long and 245 kilometers wide. The Alpena Amberley Ridge is one submerged feature among many in the lake's complex subsurface topography. Systematic sonar survey of the entire lake floor has not been conducted at the resolution that would be needed to identify stone features of the type found in 2007. The 2007 discovery was made during a survey that was not specifically targeting archaeological features. It found what it found partly by luck and partly because the researchers had the background knowledge to recognize what the sonar returns were showing them. What the lake floor of Lake Huron and the other Great Lakes contains, in terms of pre-contact features from the periods when the lake levels were lower and the exposed surfaces were inhabited, is largely unknown. The total area of the Great Lakes basin that was above water during the glacial low stand period is substantial. It was inhabited. The people who inhabited it built things. Some of those things are now underwater. How many and where is a question that has barely been asked. The Canadian side of the Lake Huron discovery is particularly interesting. The Alpena Amberley Ridge extends into Canadian waters, and the Ontario shoreline of Lake Huron has its own long history of habitation and its own complex of submerged features from the low stand period. The University of Michigan team's surveys were conducted primarily in Michigan waters for logistical reasons. Whether comparable surveys have been conducted in Ontario waters, and with what results, is not information this account has been able to confirm. The Anishinaabe peoples of the Lake Huron shoreline have traditions about the lake floor that do not describe it as empty. The underwater world in Anishinaabe cosmology is an inhabited realm, home to powerful beings and significant events. The oral traditions describe specific places in the lake as having features or history that the land-based world does not share. Whether any of these traditional accounts correspond to specific physical features of the lake floor is a question that would require both careful reading of the traditions and systematic survey of the areas they describe, a project that has not been undertaken. What the Lake Huron underwater discoveries do, more broadly, is confirm that the pre-contact landscape of Canada extended into territory that is now submerged, and that the features built in that landscape are still there, preserved underwater in conditions that are in some ways better for long-term preservation than the conditions on land. Stone structures survive underwater. They survive exceptionally well in cold, relatively low biological activity fresh water. 10-year-old hunting blinds on the floor of Lake Huron look like hunting blinds on the floor of Lake Huron. They have not been eroded or overgrown, or built over, or poured over with concrete. This is, in its way, hopeful. The things that are underwater are still there, to be found. The question is whether we will look for them before whatever other processes might affect them, the dredging, the development, the warming of lake temperatures, the changes in biological activity that climate change is producing, to eliminate them. The Geological Survey of Canada was established in 1842, and for the next 100 years, it sent geologists and surveyors into every corner of the country to map, sample, measure, and describe. These men, and they were overwhelmingly men in that period, were trained observers. They were out in the field, in terrain that most people never saw, looking at rocks and soils and landforms with careful professional eyes. And some of them noticed things that were not rocks. The field notes and survey reports of the early GSE are a remarkable archive. They are not famous. They are not widely read outside of the specific communities of researchers who have reason to consult them for their primary purpose, which is geological information. But they contain, scattered through decades of professional scientific reporting, observations of things that do not fit the geological context, that do not have geological explanations, and that the surveyors noted with the careful precision of people trained to record accurately what they saw. A survey party working in the Precambrian Shield country of Northern Ontario in 1891 filed a report that included, in a section about glacial till deposits in a watershed east of the present location of Sudbury, a note about a section of ridge where the till had been disturbed in a pattern that the lead geologist described as consistent with excavation. He used that word. He noted the feature's dimensions, roughly 40 feet by 20 feet, and its depth, which he estimated at about 6 feet below the original surface, and he noted that the rock at the bottom of the disturbed area had been, as he put it, smoothed by a process he could not identify. He recorded it and moved on. This note is in the 1891 Sudbury District Survey Report at the GSC's archive in Ottawa. It has been read by the geologists who have used the report for its primary purpose since it was filed. No one, to this account's knowledge, has pursued the anomalous note about the disturbed till and smoothed rock face. In 1907, a survey party working in the Laurentians north of Montreal encountered during the course of a drainage survey along a river tributary a section of riverbank that contained what the party chief described in his field notes as cut stone below the natural bank level. He estimated the stones at about 2 feet square, flat-sided, and arranged in what he called a rough course, by which he meant they were stacked in a way that suggested a constructed wall rather than a natural formation. He noted the location by triangulation survey. He did not excavate. The field notes were submitted with the survey report. The 1907 Laurentian survey is in the GSC archive. The specific field note about the cut stone is part of the collection. Whether the location has been revisited, or whether the feature is still there, or has been eroded by a century of riverbank change, is not information available to this account. A 1934 survey of the Abitibi region of Quebec, conducted during a period of active prospecting activity in the area, included a series of field notes from a geologist named Thomas Archambault, who was mapping superficial deposits in the area west of Val d'Or. Archambault's notes are meticulous and detailed, as good survey notes should be. In one entry, he described finding what he called a worked stone feature on a section of elevated ground overlooking a lake. He described it as approximately 30 feet in diameter, circular, with a depression in the center that he thought might indicate a former hearth. He noted that the stone forming the outer ring had been selected and placed with some care, and that the feature did not resemble any natural geological formation. He wrote at the end of the entry, likely pre-contact, purpose unknown. Archambault was a geologist, not an archaeologist. He had no professional framework for classifying the feature beyond likely pre-contact. He did not know whether it was a recent feature of the historically known Algonquian populations of the area or something older. He noted it accurately, labelled it correctly by what he knew, and moved on to the next grid section. The 1934 Abitibi survey report is in the GSC archive. Archambault's field notes are part of the collection. The feature he described, on its elevated ground above a lake west of Val d'Or, is in a location that was subsequently the subject of prospecting and then mining activity. Whether the feature still exists is not known to this account. These individual cases, drawn from a sample of the GSC archive that no one has systematically reviewed for anomalous observations, illustrate the general pattern. The surveyors were out there, in the field, looking at the ground carefully. They found things. They noted them with professional precision. The notes went into the archive. The archive was used for its primary purpose, and the anomalous notes were not extracted, assembled, or analysed. Somewhere in the GSC archive, in the hundreds of thousands of pages of field notes from a century and a half of geological survey, there is a catalogue of pre-contact anomalies waiting to be assembled. It would not be a small catalogue. It would not describe a sparse or empty landscape. It would describe a country full of things that the people doing the survey were trained to notice but not trained to interpret. The assembly of that catalogue has not been done because no one has funded it, organised it, or made it a research priority. It requires a sustained, systematic review of a very large archive by people who understand both the primary geological content and the cultural archaeology context needed to interpret the anomalous observations. That is a rare combination of expertise and a lot of hours. Possibly someday it will happen, possibly not. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway is one of the great engineering stories of Canadian history. Between 1881 and 1885, a railway line was driven through some of the most difficult terrain on the continent, across the Shield, through the mountains, along the canyon walls of the Fraser River, linking the country from coast to coast. The story of how it was built, the labour, the dynamite, the politics, the financing, has been told many times. What has been told less often is what the construction crews found in the ground. The CPR right-of-way crossed territory that had been inhabited for thousands of years. The Shield country of northern Ontario had been inhabited since the glacial retreat. The prairie sections of Saskatchewan and Alberta had been inhabited for as long as the bison had been there, and longer. The British Columbia interior was among the most densely inhabited pre-contact territories in what is now Canada. Everywhere the railway builders went, they were cutting through landscape that had human history in it. The construction gangs that built the railway were not archaeologists. They were working to a schedule under conditions that left little time for anything but the work in front of them. They blasted through rock, graded embankments, filled gullies, and laid ties and rails across terrain that had never before been mechanically disturbed. In the process, they encountered, in cut faces and grading operations, and excavations for water towers and stations, things that were not geological. The railway company kept construction records. Those records, held in various archives, including the CPR's own historical collection in Calgary and Library and Archives Canada, include reports from section supervisors and construction managers along the line. In those records, scattered through hundreds of pages of routine operational data, there are observations of non-geological features encountered during construction. The most detailed cluster of such observations comes from the Shield section in northern Ontario, between Sudbury and White River, where the railway cut through Precambrian granite and the detritus left over the rock's long history. A construction supervisor named James Dillon, whose section ran through a stretch of the north shore of Lake Superior, filed 3 reports in 1883 and 1884 that mentioned stone features encountered in the course of grading operations. The first report mentioned what Dillon called worked stone in a cut face north of the planned station location. The second mentioned a section of the right-of-way where the grading revealed a flat stone surface at about 4 feet depth that appeared to have been laid deliberately. The third mentioned the remains of what he called an old wall of dry stone construction exposed in a cut through a ridge. Dillon's 3 reports are in the CPR construction records. They were filed, acknowledged, and no follow-up action was taken, because the follow-up would have been outside the scope of the construction contract. The grading continued. The railway was built. The features Dillon described are now under or adjacent to the railway right-of-way in northern Ontario. In the British Columbia section, the records of the canyon construction are less well preserved because the conditions of construction in the Fraser Canyon were extremely hazardous and the administrative apparatus of the project was stretched thin. But a memoir, written by a construction engineer named Franklin Holt, published privately in 1892, includes a chapter about the BC construction that mentions finding, in the course of blasting a ledge in the canyon wall near a place the Nlakapamux, called a name he rendered as the place of the old markings, a section of what he called carved wall above the blast site. He described geometric patterns cut into the cliff face, extending over an area roughly 10 feet wide, that were not accessible from any ledge or natural surface he could see without a rope. He photographed them, or attempted to. He noted that his photographs did not come out satisfactorily. The memoir was printed in 100 copies, and most of them are not in any library this account can identify. The pattern in the railway records is the same as the pattern in the geological survey records. Things found, noted accurately, not investigated, incorporated into the archive of things nobody reads for that purpose. The scale of the railway construction project across the country means the potential archive of such observations is large, but it is distributed across a vast institutional paper trail that has never been reviewed for this specific category of information. The specific case of the BC Canyon is additionally interesting because of the Nlaka connection. The name that Holt rendered as the place of the old markings is a reasonable anglicization of a place name in the Nlaka language that refers to a location on the canyon wall where marks had been made by the people who lived there before the current Nlaka. The tradition about the marks and about who made them was known to the Nlaka at the time of railway construction. What happened to the section of canyon wall above the blast site, and whether the marks Holt described are still there or were destroyed in subsequent blasting operations, is not information this account has been able to determine. At some point in this account, the accumulation of individual cases raises a question that goes beyond any particular feature or any particular observer. The question is about scale. How large was the pre-contact population of what is now Canada, and what does that population size imply about the density of the material culture they left behind? The conventional estimates of pre-contact indigenous population in Canada have varied widely over the decades, and the methodology for producing them is genuinely difficult. The primary approach has been to work backward from historical population counts, accounting for the catastrophic disease events of the contact period and the subsequent years, and attempt to estimate what the pre-contact population must have been before those events. The problem is that the disease events were so severe and the historical counts so unreliable and the timing so variable across regions that the uncertainty in the backward projection is very large. The most widely cited current estimates for the pre-contact indigenous population of what is now Canada range from roughly 500,000 to 2 million people. This is an enormous range, a factor of 4, and the spread reflects genuine uncertainty rather than scholarly disagreement about a specific number that someone has calculated correctly. The true number is somewhere in this range, and it matters enormously for the question this account is asking. A population of 500,000 people spread over the area of Canada would produce a very different material record from a population of 2 million. The higher number implies a settlement pattern with much higher local densities in productive regions, much more intensive land use, and much more substantial infrastructure to support people and their activities. The lower number implies something closer to the dispersed small band pattern that dominated 20th century thinking about pre-contact populations. The evidence from the ancient DNA revolution is beginning to address this question from a different angle. Ancient DNA samples from pre-contact individuals across North America, assembled and analyzed in the past decade, have produced a picture of population dynamics that includes periods of population expansion and periods of population decline. Some of the expansion events, documented in the genetic record as periods when the effective population size was growing, appear to correspond to periods of significant investment in permanent or semi-permanent infrastructure. The mound-building periods of the southeast, the major architectural investments in the southwest, the elaboration of earthwork traditions in the Midwest. Larger populations built more, and the things they built were more substantial. For the regions that became Canada, the ancient DNA record is sparser than for the continental United States, partly because the Canadian Shield's acidic soils are not ideal for the preservation of ancient DNA, and partly because the sampling has been less intensive. But the data that exists suggests that productive regions of what is now Canada, the river valleys, the coastal zones, the productive lake shores, had population densities before contact that may have been significantly higher than the simplest interpretations of the archaeological record suggested. If you combine a higher pre-contact population estimate with the correction factor that LiDAR surveys have consistently applied to conventional archaeological survey, the factor of 4 to 10 times undercount that aerial survey has found in regions where it has been applied, you get a picture of the pre-contact landscape that is very different from the one that dominated archaeology in the 20th century. Instead of a sparse distribution of small sites connected by vast empty landscape, you get a landscape that was substantially, in some regions densely, inhabited, modified, and marked. In that denser landscape, the probability that a given construction project, a road cut, a pipeline trench, a building foundation, would encounter a pre-contact feature is substantially higher, and the probability that those features, encountered by the thousands of construction projects conducted across Canada over the past century and a half, were noted and then not investigated is consistent with the pattern this account has been documenting. The features were there, they were found, they are in the archive, nobody has assembled them. The Cypress Hills, the Trent Severn channels, the Georgian Bay pavements, the Richelieu Island walls, the Ottawa Valley subsurface features, the Anticosti stone rows, the Newfoundland interior paths, the Athabasca stonework, the Quebec City wall, the railroad cuts, the geological survey notes. Each one is a data point. Assembled together, they describe a landscape that had more in it than the official story has typically acknowledged. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a claim that someone has deliberately concealed evidence of a lost civilization. It is a claim that the standard mechanisms of institutional attention, which prioritize certain questions and not others, which fund certain investigations and not others, which maintain certain frameworks and revise them slowly, have produced a systematic gap in what we know about the pre-contact history of this country. And that gap, when you look for it, is very large. The coastlines of Canada are among the longest in the world. The Atlantic coast from Labrador to the tip of Nova Scotia, the Gulf of Street. Lawrence, the Pacific coast from the northern tip of BC to the Washington border, the Arctic coast stretching across hundreds of kilometers of ice-free and ice-bound shore. These are some of the most productive coastal environments on Earth, and they have been inhabited, in some cases continuously, for thousands of years. The coastal record is in many ways the most poorly preserved archaeological record in Canada, and this is for a reason that has nothing to do with institutional neglect. Sea levels have changed, a lot. The rise in sea level following the end of the last ice age, roughly between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, inundated coastal zones that had been inhabited during the low stand period. Sites that were occupied when the sea was lower are now underwater, in some cases under tens of meters of water. The habitation record from the period when much of the coastal population would have been living on or near the shore is largely submerged. This is known, it has been discussed in the archaeological literature, but the practical implication that a substantial portion of the pre-contact coastal record is underwater and has never been systematically surveyed is one that the investigation budget of Canadian maritime archaeology has not been able to address. Underwater archaeology is expensive. The specific environments in question, cold, often murky, often deep, are difficult to work in. The surveys have not been done. On the Pacific coast, the situation is complicated by the extraordinary productivity of the coastal ecosystem and the consequently extraordinarily dense habitation of the coast in the pre-contact period. The Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and many other nations inhabited the BC coast and maintained populations in the richest sections of coast that may have been among the highest density pre-contact populations on the continent. These populations built in wood, which does not survive in the same way that stone does, but they also built substantial structures, created elaborate material culture, and modified the landscape in ways that are still being documented. What happens when populations of this density, over thousands of years, encounter the coastal landscape is the creation of what ecologists call a cultural landscape, an environment so thoroughly modified by human presence and human practice that the distinction between natural and cultural features becomes unclear. Shell, middens the size of small hills. Clam gardens, the modification of beach terrain to increase shellfish productivity that extend for kilometers of coastline. Tidal fish traps built from stone across estuaries. Ancient forest management, through selective harvesting and replanting, that has shaped the composition of the coastal forest over centuries. The clam gardens of the BC coast are particularly relevant to this account because they are a form of landscape modification that was invisible to European observers who did not know what they were looking at, that appears to have been present on the coast for at least 3,000 years, and that represents a sophistication of environmental management that the conventional picture of the coast's pre-contact inhabitants did not include. Clam gardens are terraces built along the intertidal zone, using stone walls placed along the lower edge of a beach to retain sediment and create a broader, gentler slope that is ideal for clam habitat. They increase clam density and productivity dramatically. They require sustained investment and maintenance. And they look, to an untrained eye, like natural beach features because the low stone wall and the accumulation of sediment behind it are not visually dramatic. Researchers who began systematically studying the BC coast's intertidal zone with the question of modification in mind found clam gardens throughout the Heiltsuk and related territories. They found them in places that Heiltsuk elders knew about and had not stopped managing. They found them in places where management had lapsed and the productivity had declined. They found them in places that the archaeological literature had previously described as unmodified natural beaches. The distribution of clam gardens on the BC coast is now recognized as one of the largest landscape modification systems documented in North America. It changed what the coast is. It has been there for thousands of years. It was not in the conventional picture because no one had been looking for it. This is, in miniature, the story this entire account has been telling. Things are there. Things have been there for a long time. The absence of documentation is not the same as absence. The question is who is looking, with what questions in mind, and whether the institutional and financial resources exist to pursue what the looking finds. On the Atlantic coast, the Micmac territorial waters include extensive areas of former coastal lowland now submerged beneath the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Bay of Fundy. The Bay of Fundy is famous for its extreme tides, which can run to 15 meters or more on the Nova Scotia shore. During the low stand period, when sea levels were much lower, the Bay of Fundy was a very different kind of environment, drier, with a different coastline, different ecology, different accessibility. The people who inhabited that landscape, the maritime archaic, and their predecessors and successors, would have been living in and moving through territory that is now tidal mudflat, open water, and seabed. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition has accounts of time when the water was different, when the land extended further into what is now the bay, when the sea was in a different relationship to the shore. These accounts describe a landscape that matches, in general terms, what the geological record tells us about the configuration of the Bay of Fundy during lower sea level periods. The oral tradition is tracking something real. What it is tracking includes people and their presence in a landscape that is now underwater. The rivers of the Canadian prairies move through a landscape that has been so thoroughly transformed by agriculture that it is easy to forget what it looked like before. The fields that stretch to the horizon in every direction, the grain elevators on the railway sidings, the grid of gravel roads. This is a landscape that has been worked from the air down, from the surface through the soil, and in the working of it, over more than a century of breaking sod and digging drainage ditches and building roads and running fence lines, things have come up out of the ground. The South Saskatchewan River system, including the North Saskatchewan and their tributaries, drains a large portion of the prairie interior before meeting and making its way to the Nelson River and ultimately Hudson Bay. The river valleys in this system are, by prairie standards, dramatic landscapes, cut banks of 10 to 30 meters dropping to valley floors that were inhabited intensively during the pre-contact period, protected from the wind, with reliable water, concentrated timber, and access to both valley and upland resources. The archaeological record of the river valleys is substantial, and it has been studied, but the record of what construction projects and agricultural operations have found in these valleys over the past 100 years is a different kind of document from the systematic archaeological survey. It is scattered, informal, episodic, and it describes a density of subsurface features that the formal survey record, focused as it is on visible surface expression, does not fully capture. A farmer near Battleford, Saskatchewan, whose family had been on their land since the 1890s, kept a log of objects and features found during spring fieldwork over 50 years. His daughter donated the log to the local historical museum after his death. The log is not famous. It is one of perhaps hundreds of similar documents in local historical collections across the prairies. But it describes, in the flat prose of a man who was not particularly interested in archaeology, but was careful about what he saw, a consistent pattern of features found during spring ploughing in a section of river valley land: stone circles, fire-reddened soil patches, subsurface stone arrangements at depths that suggested they had been there for a long time. bone, occasionally, that the farmer consistently reburied because disturbing the dead seemed wrong regardless of how old they were. The log is specific about location and depth and description. It spans decades and shows the same types of features appearing in the same general section of land repeatedly as the plough turned the soil. It is, in its quiet way, a detailed stratigraphic record of a heavily used pre-contact landscape. The farmer never contacted anyone about his log. He was farming. The features were an incidental observation, not a problem he needed to solve. He wrote them down because he was a methodical person who wrote things down, and then he continued farming. This log, and the hundreds of similar informal records that must exist in local historical collections across the prairies, represents a dataset that no one has assembled. It would take a systematic survey of local museums and historical societies across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta to find these records, and then a significant effort to read and extract the relevant information from what would be a huge volume of material. The information is there. The project to retrieve it has not been undertaken. The Red River Valley, which runs from North Dakota through Manitoba to Lake Winnipeg, is one of the most fertile river valleys on the continent and has been inhabited continuously since the retreat of the glaciers. The city of Winnipeg sits at the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, a location that was a major meeting and trading place in the pre-contact period, and that has been modified so thoroughly by urban development that its pre-contact character is essentially invisible at the surface. In 2001, during the construction of a utility tunnel in downtown Winnipeg, workers encountered at a depth of approximately 12 feet what the construction manager described as an old stone surface running along the bottom of the trench for about 30 feet before the trench turned and the feature was no longer visible. The construction manager noted the feature in a daily log and moved on. Whether the log was filed with the Provincial Archaeology Office, which would normally have had a monitor on a project of this type, is not something this account has been able to confirm. The tunnel was built. The stone surface is now under Winnipeg. The rivers themselves carry information. The hydrology of the Prairie River system has been modified significantly by dam construction, irrigation diversion, and channel modification over the past century. The modifications have changed water flow, sediment transport, and erosion patterns in ways that have both revealed and destroyed pre-contact features. Cut banks that have been eroding for decades expose features that were buried. But the same erosion that exposes them destroys them if no one is there to document them before the next flood carries them away. Medicine Hat, Alberta sits where the South Saskatchewan River cuts through a break in the prairie, a location that has been significant as a crossing point and a camping place since the landscape was first inhabited after the glacial retreat. The town itself was established in the 1880s as a railway divisional point, and it grew quickly on the basis of natural gas, which was discovered beneath the town in 1883, and which has been flowing to the surface in various configurations of use and waste ever since. The natural gas infrastructure of Medicine Hat required drilling, and drilling produces cores, vertical columns of soil and rock extracted from below the surface that can be read like a stratigraphic record of everything that has been deposited in a particular location over time. The gas company's drill records from the early period of Medicine Hat's development are extensive, and they are held, at least in part, in provincial energy archives. They are also, in some cases, in the company's own historical records. In 1891, a drill crew working on a gas well on the eastern edge of the early town encountered what the driller recorded in his log as a hard layer at about 15 feet that was not rock and not ice. He described it as flat stone, arranged, which was the specific word he used, arranged, and extending across his borehole. The drill bit passed through it and continued. The driller logged it, attributed it to an unusual natural feature, and continued. The gas well was completed. The drill log is in the records. Medicine Hat's location at a river crossing made it a significant place in the pre-contact landscape of the Alberta prairies. River crossings were among the most important infrastructure locations, in a world where rivers were major obstacles to movement, and where finding a good crossing could make the difference between a successful journey and a failed one. Good crossings were known, used, and in some cases, improved. Whether what the 1,000 891 driller found was a remnant of improvement to the Medicine Hat crossing location, or a natural geological anomaly that he described too specifically as arranged, is a question for which this account has only the drill log as evidence. The Blackfoot Confederacy, whose traditional territory encompasses much of what is now southern Alberta, has detailed oral knowledge of the landscape in the Medicine Hat area, knowledge accumulated over a very long period of inhabitation of the northern plains. The Blackfoot territorial knowledge is among the richest and most comprehensive bodies of landscape knowledge associated with any plains, culture, and it includes specific information about significant locations along the South Saskatchewan system. The place that became Medicine Hat is known in the Blackfoot tradition by a name that refers to a spiritual event that occurred at the river crossing. The nature of the event, as recorded in the ethnographic literature, involves beings who came from below and who left marks on the crossing place that were visible for some time after. The marks are described in terms that are not purely metaphorical in the tradition. They are described as physical things that could be seen and touched. Whether those marks are still there, at whatever depth, and whether the 1,891 drillers' arranged stones were in any way related to them, is a question nobody has pursued. The broader pattern, of which Medicine Hat is one instance, is of major crossing locations and travel corridor nodes that were significant in the pre-contact landscape and that are now occupied by towns and cities. The geography that made these places attractive as crossing points, camping places, and gathering locations in the pre-contact period is the same geography that made them attractive as railway division points, trading centres, and eventually cities. The pre-contact infrastructure and the colonial infrastructure are in the same places for the same reasons. And when the colonial infrastructure was being built, it went down on top of whatever the pre-contact use had left behind. The towns of the Canadian prairies sit on some of the most intensively used pre-contact landscapes in the country. The river crossings were not used occasionally or by small numbers of people. They were major nodes in a continental network of movement and trade that connected the prairie interior to the Great Lakes, to the Missouri Basin, to the Rocky Mountain passes, and to the northern forests. The amounts of material culture that accumulated at these nodes over thousands of years of use should, by any reasonable estimate, be substantial. What is under the towns is the record of that use. There is an archive in this country that has never been assembled, but whose components are scattered across hundreds of institutions, attics, church basements, museum back rooms, and private collections. It is the archive of what was found during the colonial era settlement of Canada, and noted down by the people who found it. Not the things that were found in formal archaeological contexts, by trained archaeologists with institutional support and publication channels. The other things, the things found by farmers, road builders, missionaries, prospectors, school teachers, country doctors, postal workers, and ordinary people who had the habit of writing things down. These people wrote letters, kept diaries, filed reports, contributed to local newspapers, donated to local museums, gave interviews to local historians. And in those letters and diaries and reports and newspaper items and museum donations and historical interviews, scattered through a vast and uncatalogued documentary record, is an enormous quantity of information about what they found in the ground and what they saw in the landscape. Consider the missionaries. The Catholic missions in Canada, particularly the Jesuit missions that extended through the Great Lakes and the Lawrence Basin, and eventually deep into the interior, produced one of the most extensive documentation projects in North American colonial history. The Jesuit Relations, the annual reports sent to the Jesuit General in France from the Canadian missions, are a remarkable primary source for the history of the contact period. They have been published, translated, and studied extensively, but the relations are the formal output. Behind them is a much larger body of documentation: the working papers, the draft notes, the personal journals, the correspondence between individual missionaries, the administrative records of individual missions and mission networks. This material is scattered across archives in France, Quebec, Rome, and various North American institutions. It has not been systematically reviewed for observations about pre-contact features in the landscape. The researchers who use it are interested in what it says about indigenous cultures, about the history of the church, about colonial history, about the natural history of the contact period. They are not reading it with the question in mind: What did these missionaries observe that was constructed before their arrival? The country doctors of rural Canada in the 19th and early 20th centuries were another category of careful observer. They travelled widely, often in remote areas, and they had the scientific habits of people trained to observe and record. A country doctor might travel 30 or 40 miles in a day's round of calls, across terrain that no one else was seeing systematically. Some of them kept journals. Some journals ended up in local archives. In those journals, occasionally, there are observations about things seen along the roads and fields and creek banks and hillsides that were not there naturally. One such journal, kept by a doctor in a rural area of New Brunswick between 1898 and 1931, and now held in a provincial archives, includes, among thousands of pages of medical observations and personal reflections, 4 entries that describe features in the landscape that the doctor found puzzling. In 1906, he described a section of stream bank near a patient's farm that exposed what he called evidently dressed stone at a depth of about 4 feet, which he thought might be the remains of an old mill, but that he noted was in a location where no mill had stood in the memory of anyone he asked. In 1912, he described a section of elevated ground near a lake shore where the vegetation grew differently from the surrounding forest, in a pattern he called too regular to be accidental. In 1924, he described finding, while cutting across a woodlot, a low stone wall that he estimated at several hundred feet long, and that he could not connect to any known field or property boundary. And in 1929, he described a second stone surface encountered when a patient was digging a root cellar, this one at about 3 feet depth, smooth and flat. The doctor wrote these observations in his journal because that is what doctors of that era did with things they found interesting and puzzling. He did not pursue them further because they were not his professional concern. The observations sat in his journal. The journal sat in the archive. The school teachers of rural Canada were similarly positioned as careful, literate observers of landscape who had no professional mechanism for following up anomalous observations. In a country where the school teacher was often the most educated person in a rural community, and where the teacher was frequently assigned the task of contributing to the local chapter of whatever regional historical survey was underway, the school records and the regional historical surveys contain an enormous quantity of material that no one has read for this purpose. The local historical societies across Canada, which have been collecting, preserving, and occasionally publishing material about their regions for over a century, are repositories of exactly this kind of informal documentation. They hold the farmers' logs and the doctors' journals and the surveyors' field notes and the missionaries' correspondence and the school teachers' contributions to the regional survey. Their collections are overwhelmingly uncatalogued in any digital form. Accessing them requires physical presence and considerable patience, but the information is there, waiting. The assembly of this distributed archive, the reading of local history collections across the country for anomalous pre-contact observations, would be an enormous project. It would require a coordinated effort involving dozens of researchers, years of work, and funding that has never been made available for this purpose. The result would be the most comprehensive account of pre-contact features in the Canadian landscape ever assembled, drawn from sources that have been sitting in archives for a century or more. That account has not been written. This account is a much smaller thing, a sampling of examples drawn from sources that this account's research has been able to identify. The complete picture is larger by an unknown but certainly significant factor. The north shore of Lake Superior between Thunder Bay and Wawa is one of the most dramatically beautiful stretches of shoreline in Canada. The Precambrian shield comes right down to the lake there, and the rock faces, polished by glaciers and fractured by time, rise directly from the water in cliffs that reach in some places to 100 meters. The lake at that point is clear and cold and very deep. It does not forgive mistakes. The Anishinaabe know the North Shore as Gitchigami, the Great Sea, and their relationship with it is recorded in oral tradition in more detail and over more time than any written history of the region. The shore has names for every bay and point and headland, names that carry information about what the place offers and what it demands and what happened there. The naming tradition is a form of mapping that is older than any paper chart of the lake and more detailed in its local knowledge than anything produced by European cartography. Among the named places on the North Shore are several that the tradition identifies as places where things were made or done by beings who were not the ancestors of the current Anishinaabe. These are not supernatural beings in the sense of beings who could not have built physical things. They are described as people capable of building who came before. The things they built are described as being in specific locations, and some of those locations are on or near the current lakeshore. In 1902, a prospector named Henry Greer, who was working the North Shore for copper prospects, found, in the course of scrambling along a cliff face looking for mineral signs, a section of wall construction set into a natural crevice in the rock face at about 10 meters above the current water level. The wall closed off the crevice, forming what would have been an enclosed space accessible from the lakeside at the lower end. Greer noted the feature in his prospecting log, described it as being of dry stone construction with some care taken in the fitting, and noted that the stones used were not the granite of the cliff face, but a different rock that he did not identify further. He recorded the location by triangulation from two prominent shore features. Greer's prospecting log is in a private collection in Thunder Bay. This account knows of it through a reference in a 1967 article about the history of Lake Superior copper prospecting, written for a Northern Ontario local history publication. The 1967 article quoted from Greer's log directly and noted the feature but expressed no opinion about its significance. The article's primary subject was the prospecting history of the North Shore, and the Greer observation was included as one of many incidental details. Whether the feature Greer found is still there, or whether a century of lakeshore erosion and frost cycling has destroyed it, is unknown. The location he recorded by triangulation from shore features that may or may not still exist in recognizable form has not, as far as this account can determine, been revisited. The Sleeping Giant, the large peninsula east of Thunder Bay, whose topographic profile against the sky does suggest a reclining figure, is one of the most prominent landscape features on the North Shore. Its prominence in the Anishinaabe oral tradition is commensurate with its visual prominence in the landscape. The tradition associates the sleeping giant with Nanabozo, the trickster figure of Anishinaabe cosmology, and describes the transformation of a being into the rocky peninsula as a punishment for revealing the location of a silver mine to people from the outside world. The silver mine, in the tradition, is usually understood in the scholarly literature as a metaphorical or symbolic element. But there are people in the Thunder Bay Anishinaabe community who understand it more literally. They describe the tradition as encoding specific geographical knowledge, the location of a significant resource deposit, and the circumstances under which that knowledge was lost or sequestered. Whether the tradition is tracking a real silver deposit, a real encounter between a resource-holding community and outside prospectors, and a real deliberate sequestering of geographical knowledge, is not something the scholarly literature has generally been interested in pursuing. The North Shore of Lake Superior has had significant mineral wealth extracted from it. The silver mines of the Nipigon area, discovered in the colonial period, were substantial. The copper deposits of the North Shore have been worked at various periods. What was known about these deposits before European contact, and by whom, and what was done to manage the knowledge of their locations, is a question that the Anishinaabe tradition speaks to, but that the scholarly literature has not engaged with in a sustained, analytical way. The Lake Superior shoreline as a whole is a place where the pre-contact history is long, documented in oral tradition in great depth, and physically represented in features that have been noticed by European observers over the past 2 centuries, but not systematically investigated. The combination of the oral tradition, the scattered observations in colonial-era prospecting and exploration records, and the lake's documented role as a center of the continental copper trade, suggests that what was happening on this shore and in the lake over the past several thousand years was significantly more complex and more organized than the conventional account of sparse shield country habitation implies. The Arctic coast of Canada presents a different set of questions from the southern regions this account has mostly been examining. In the Arctic, the pre-contact history is less obscured by colonial period construction, because the density of colonial period construction on the Arctic coast is much lower than in the south. What obscures the Arctic record is different: the extreme difficulty of the environment, the limited resources available for archaeological investigation, and the specific challenges of working in permafrost terrain where the stratigraphy that normally allows archaeologists to separate different periods of occupation is often compressed or disrupted by freeze-thaw cycles. The Thule people, who were the ancestors of the modern Inuit, moved eastward from Alaska across the Canadian Arctic, beginning roughly 1,000 years ago. They moved fast, as population expansions go, and by about 700 years ago they had reached the Atlantic coast of Labrador and the shores of Greenland. They were extraordinarily capable people, adapted to the Arctic with a sophistication that commands genuine admiration. Their boats, their hunting technology, their cold weather gear, their ability to read and navigate Arctic seas and sea ice were at the peak of what any culture has achieved in that environment. The Thule movement was not into an empty landscape. It was into a landscape occupied by the Dorset people, who had been in the eastern Arctic for roughly 3,000 years. The relationship between the Thule and the Dorset is one of the most discussed problems in Arctic archaeology. Did the Thule displace the Dorset through competition, through conflict? Did they absorb them? The answer is probably different in different places and at different times. The Dorset disappeared from the archaeological record over the course of the period of Thule expansion. By roughly 500 years ago, there are no more Dorset sites. The Dorset people left an archaeological record that is impressive in its own right. They built winter houses of stone and sod in substantial communities. They produced art at a level of sophistication that continues to attract scholarly attention. Ivory carvings of great skill and evident spiritual significance. They managed the Arctic environment effectively for 3,000 years, which is by any measure a successful long-term adaptation. What the Dorset also left, in certain locations along the Arctic coast and on Arctic islands, are larger stone features that have been a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. These are not the standard Dorset house structures, which are well documented and understood. They are more substantial, more deliberately placed, and more extensive. In a few locations, they appear to form alignments or arrangements at a scale that exceeds the requirements of ordinary winter habitation. On one of the larger islands in the Fox Basin, which lies between Baffin Island and the Melville Peninsula in the eastern Arctic, a survey, conducted in the 1970s, found a cluster of stone features on an elevated headland that the survey team could not entirely account for in terms of standard Dorset habitation. The features included the usual house remnants, but also a series of standing stones and stone cairns, arranged on the headland, in a pattern that the lead archaeologist described in the survey report as possibly serving a navigational or calendar function. The survey report was filed with the Federal Archaeological Authority and was later cited in 2 synthetic works on Dorset culture, neither of which discussed the navigational or calendar interpretation in any detail. Whether the headland features served a navigational or calendar function, or some other purpose not captured by those terms, is a question that a single survey in the 1970s, conducted under the resource limitations of Arctic fieldwork in that period, could not answer. The features are still there, on the headland in the Fox Basin, unchanged by any subsequent human activity in a region where human activity remains sparse. They are waiting for someone to return and look at them more carefully. The Inuit knowledge of the Dorset is extensive, more extensive in some respects than the written archaeological account. The Inuit were there when the Dorset was still present in some areas, and they observed them. The Inuit oral tradition about the Tunit, as the Dorset are called, includes information about their construction practices, their habitation sites, and their capabilities that has been useful to archaeologists trying to understand the material record. The tradition describes the Tunit as building in stone more than the Inuit did, as making houses that were larger and heavier, as being extraordinarily strong but relatively shy or passive in their dealings with the arriving Inuit. The description of the Tunit as building in stone in ways that the Inuit did not matches the archaeological record. The Dorset house structures are more substantial than the Thule period Inuit structures that replaced them in most areas. And in the elevated headland features on the Fox Basin Island, the stone construction exceeds in scale and ambition even the standard Dorset house tradition. What the Dorset were building on that headland, and why, and whether there are comparable features elsewhere along the Arctic coast that have not yet been surveyed, are questions that the Arctic archaeological literature has not yet answered. The Arctic coast is very large and very remote. Systematic survey of its full extent at the resolution needed to find features of this scale has not been conducted. The features that have been found opportunistically during surveys conducted for other purposes. At some point, after following all of these threads, it is worth asking the obvious question. What would it actually mean if systematic investigation of the features described in this account produced findings that substantially revised the conventional picture of pre-contact Canada? The answer is not simple, and it is worth being careful about it, because the question of what pre-contact North America looked like has been entangled with political and legal questions that give it a weight beyond academic interest. Claims about the nature and scale of Indigenous civilization in Canada are not neutral. They have been used, in different hands, to support and to undermine the rights and claims of the Indigenous peoples who are here now. The conventional 20th century picture of pre-contact Canada as a sparsely inhabited landscape of small mobile bands was not developed in a political vacuum. It was developed during a period when the land was being settled by immigrants from Europe, when the legal and political foundations of that settlement were being worked out, and when there were material incentives, not necessarily conscious but real nonetheless, to see the landscape that was being settled as having been essentially empty, or at least not used in ways that would complicate the legal and moral project of settlement. A revised picture, one that acknowledges denser pre-contact population, more extensive infrastructure, more deliberate landscape modification, more sophisticated organization, is not simply an academic correction to an outdated model. It is also an argument that the landscape of Canada was more thoroughly inhabited and more extensively used than the settlement narrative acknowledged, and that what was taken was, in a sense, more. This account is not trying to make that argument directly. This account is trying to document the evidence, scattered and incomplete as it is, that there is more in the Canadian landscape than the conventional picture has described. The political and legal implications of that evidence are for others, with the relevant expertise and standing to address. But the academic implications are worth noting. A revised understanding of pre-contact Canadian landscape use would change what we understand about the capabilities and scale of the populations who preceded European contact. It would change what we understand about the pre-contact continental trade networks that connected Canada to the rest of the continent. It would change what we understand about the degree of landscape modification that was occurring in the centuries before European arrival. And it would change what we understand about the mechanisms by which all that accumulated knowledge, all that landscape modification, all that infrastructure was lost or obscured in the disruption of the contact period. Because one thing that the revision would make clear is the scale of what was lost. The disruption of the contact period was not the disruption of a sparse, marginal population that had made few marks on the landscape. If the revised picture is correct, it was the disruption of a dense, complex, landscape-modifying civilization or set of civilizations that had been developing their characteristic forms of organization and infrastructure for thousands of years. The disruption was much larger in scale than the conventional picture allows for. This changes, or should change, how we think about what the Indigenous peoples of Canada are carrying forward. When an elder speaks of traditional ecological knowledge, she is not speaking of the knowledge of small bands of foragers who happen to live off the land. She is potentially speaking of knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by dense, organized, landscape-modifying societies that understood their territories in extraordinary depth. The knowledge is correspondingly deep and correspondingly significant. The loss of that knowledge, through disease, displacement, residential schools, and the systematic dismantling of the social structures that maintained and transmitted it, is a loss that the revised picture would make larger and more specific. Not a loss of ways and stories, but a loss of detailed, tested, refined knowledge about how to inhabit and manage some of the most complex landscapes on Earth. Knowledge that took thousands of years to develop and that may not be fully recoverable even now. None of this requires that the anomalous features documented in this account be anything other than what the most cautious interpretations suggest. Even if the stone features under Kingston and the stone pavement in Georgian Bay and the terraced ridgelines in BC and the worked stone channels of the Trent Severn system are exactly what the careful observers who found them described, without any additional significance beyond their basic nature as pre-contact constructions, they add to a picture that is already more complex and more significant than the conventional account acknowledges. The conventional account has been revised before, it will be revised again. The process of revision is slow because it requires new evidence, new methods, and a willingness to revisit established frameworks that have institutional inertia behind them. But it is happening. The LiDAR surveys, the ancient DNA analysis, the underwater sonar surveys, the new methodologies for dating and characterizing features, these are producing evidence that is steadily expanding the picture of what was here before the concrete went down. The features in the construction reports and the survey notes and the private letters are part of that evidence. They are not systematic, they are not comprehensive. They are the inadvertent observations of people doing something else, people who happened to be in a position to see something and who had the habit of writing it down. But they are real, and they point in a consistent direction. The foreman who poured the concrete on Elgin Street in 1912 has been dead for many decades. His grandson, who found the journal in the shoebox in 1987, closed it and put it away. Whether the journal still exists, whether someone will one day read it and understand what it was describing, whether the feature under the concrete of Elgin Street is still there or has been disturbed by a century of utility work and foundation repair, these are questions that cannot be answered from the outside. But the story of that journal, with its cautious description of something found and then covered, is a perfect miniature of everything this account has been examining. The thing is there, the record exists. The record sits in a box or a drawer or a filing cabinet or an archive somewhere, waiting for someone to read it with the right question in mind. And the concrete sits on top of whatever the concrete sits on top of. Canada is a country that is still in the early stages of understanding its own past. The documentary history of the European settlement period is rich and well studied. The archaeology of the pre-contact period has produced impressive bodies of knowledge in the regions where it has been most intensively pursued. But the gap between those two bodies of knowledge, the gap that covers the full scope of what was here before European eyes saw it, and the full scope of what was found and then buried under the settlement project, that gap is very large, and it has not been filled. What fills it, slowly and imperfectly, is the kind of scattered documentation that this account has been drawing on. The construction reports, and the survey notes, and the missionary letters, and the farmer's log, and the doctor's journal, and the railway supervisor's daily record. The oral traditions of the peoples whose ancestors were in this landscape for thousands of years before anyone else arrived. The new tools, the LiDAR and the sonar, and the ancient DNA analysis that are finding features and patterns that conventional methods could not see. The filling of that gap will not happen all at once. It will not happen with a single dramatic discovery, a sealed chamber, or a lost city, or a cache of objects that rewrite the textbook overnight. It will happen the way it has been happening, piece by piece, observation by observation, archive by archive. Someone will read the geological survey notes from the Abitibi in 1934 and follow up on the Thomas Archambault notation. Someone will dive in the Richelieu River channels with the right equipment and find out what is on the bottom. Someone will obtain a LiDAR dataset for a section of the Trent Severn watershed and process it looking for the features that the 2019 provincial report recommended ground truthing. Someone will sit with Innu elders on the Quebec North Shore and ask specifically about Anticosti Island, about what was on the plateau, about who made the rose. Each of those someones will need support that is not currently guaranteed. They will need funding and institutional backing and access to archives and the goodwill of communities whose knowledge they need and the time to do careful work in difficult conditions. Whether they will get those things depends on priorities that are made by institutions and governments and funding bodies that have many other claims on their resources. But the things themselves are not going anywhere. The submerged pavement in the Georgian Bay Channel is still there, under the same cold water it has been under since Edmund Forrester saw it in 1950, and his supervisor told him not to put it in the report. The terraced ridgeline east of Cache Creek is still there, stripped bare by the 2019 fire, waiting for someone with the right questions to come and look at it. The stone rows on Anticosti Island are still there, presumably, if the logging and the development of the western coast has not reached that far into the interior. Thomas Archambault's circular stone feature on its elevated ground in the Abitibi is probably still there, or was the last time any human being walked past it, which may have been the day in 1934 when Archambault described it in his field log. The land holds what it holds. It has been holding it for a long time. The question is not whether the record is there. The question is whether we are paying attention. This country has a past that goes back 12,000 years at a minimum in most regions, and longer in the areas that escaped glaciation. That past was lived by people who modified the landscape, built infrastructure, accumulated knowledge, and maintained complex social organizations for thousands of years. Some of what they built is still there, under the concrete and the asphalt and the farm fields and the lake water and the accumulated sediment of the centuries. Some of it is still there because the environments that preserved it are cold and stable and unfriendly to the biological processes that destroy things. Some of it is still there simply because nobody has yet disturbed the specific ground it occupies. The things under the oldest towns of Canada are part of a much longer story than the plaque on the heritage building will tell you. The 400 years of documented colonial history sit on top of something vastly older, something that was complex and organized and capable of building things that people with no particular reason to expect them find and notice and write down and then move on from, because nobody's contract covers whatever this is. The question of what this country's oldest towns are built on has not been systematically answered. The evidence that it is worth asking is scattered across the archives and oral traditions and inadvertent observations of a century and a half of people doing other things in a landscape full of things from before. That landscape is under the concrete. It has been there the whole time. It is not going anywhere. There is a way of standing in one of the older parts of a Canadian city, in Kingston or Quebec City or Winnipeg or any of the river towns that grew out of earlier places, and feeling the age of the ground you are standing on. Not the age of the buildings, which are recent by any real measure, but the age of the location itself, the spot chosen because of its geography, used because of what it offered, returned to generation after generation long before any of the current structures were there. The Anishinaabe elder in the Georgian Bay Territory, the one whose phrase, "the water road used to go through there," was written down by a missionary and then not pursued, was standing in such a place. The physician in New Brunswick who wrote in his diary about the dressed stone in the stream bank was in such a place. The farm family near Battleford, whose log of spring ploughing observations sits in a local museum, was on such a place, season after season, their machines cutting through a landscape that had been worked by other people's hands long before theirs. These are the same places. The places that were useful before are the places that are still being used. The geography doesn't change, or changes slowly enough, that the features that made a location significant 10,000 years ago often still make it significant now. The river crossing is still a river crossing. The protected harbour is still a protected harbour. The elevated plateau with the good sight lines is still a good place to see the landscape from. What is under the current use is the accumulated record of all the previous uses. Some of that record has been disturbed beyond recovery. Some of it has been noted and filed away. Some of it has not yet been encountered. And some of it is sitting, perfectly preserved, in the cold dark below the concrete, below the building foundations, below the drainage pipes and the utility conduits and all the infrastructure of modern life, waiting for someone to be curious enough to go and look. This is not a story with an ending. The ending would be the systematic investigation of the features documented in this account and the thousands of similar features that this account has not been able to document because the archive has not yet been read. That investigation has not happened. It may happen. It may not happen within the lifetime of anyone listening to this now. But the curiosity that would motivate it, the question of what was here before and what signs of it remain, is a legitimate and serious question. It is a question that the evidence, such as it is, rewards rather than closes. Every time someone has been curious enough to look, they have found something. The Georgian Bay diver found a pavement. The Trent 7 workers found a stone channel. The habitant geologist found disturbed till. The New Brunswick doctor found dressed stone in a riverbank. The farm family near Battleford found stone circles season after season. What would be found if someone looked systematically, with the right tools and the right questions and the sustained attention that the evidence merits, is the question that the scattered observations in this account are pointing toward. The answer is not known. It cannot be known without the looking. But the indications are that it would be, at minimum, a significantly more complex and more substantial answer than the conventional picture of pre-contact Canada has prepared anyone to expect. The journal that the foreman wrote in 1912 described something he found and then covered with concrete. His grandson read it in 1987 and put it away. Somewhere, possibly, It is still in a box in a house in that Ontario town. Possibly, someone will find it again and read it, and this time decide to dig. And if they do, what they find under the concrete of Elgin Street might be exactly what the foreman described. Something that has no name in the official history of the country, something that was there before the history began, something that has been waiting under the concrete for someone to be curious enough to come back. Canada's oldest towns are built on old ground. The ground was used long before the towns existed. Some of that use left marks. The marks are there, under the concrete, under the lake, under the forest floor, in the archives, in the oral traditions, in the inadvertent observations of people who were doing something else and noticed what was there. The full account of those marks has not been written. This account is not that full account. It is only the beginning of a set of questions that deserves much better answers than it has received. But the questions are there. The evidence that they are worth asking is there. And the landscape, with everything it holds and everything it waits to reveal, is there. It has been there a very long time. It will be there when we are ready to look. The town in Ontario is sleeping now. The concrete is quiet. The thing beneath the concrete does not need to hurry. It has been there since before the town existed, since before the road existed, since before anyone poured anything over it at all. It will still be there in the morning, and the morning after that, and for as many mornings as it takes before someone decides that the question of what it is matters enough to find out. Sleep well. There is a lot of ground to cover, and most of it, as it turns out, has something under it. If what you heard tonight left something in you, some question you did not have before, that is the feeling worth following. The archives are real. The oral traditions are real. The things in the ground are real. The only thing missing is the systematic attention that would connect them into a coherent picture. That attention begins with curiosity, and curiosity begins with listening to what the evidence is actually saying, rather than what the institutional frameworks expect it to say. There are people working on this, quietly, in university departments and community archives, and on muddy riverbanks and in cold lake water. There are people who are trying to read the landscape more carefully than it has been read before. They need more support than they are getting. They need more public understanding of why the question matters. They need the institutional will to pause the construction project long enough to find out what is in the ground. You can be part of that in the way that you can be part of anything you care about in the modern world. You can pay attention. You can be curious. You can, when someone tells you that a construction crew found something interesting and unexpected and then poured concrete on it, feel that as the small loss that it is. There are so many things under the concrete. There are so many questions that have been asked once and then not asked again. There are so many archives sitting in back rooms, so many journals in shoeboxes, so many observations filed and forgotten, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them saying the same thing in their various ways. There was more here than we thought. There is still more here than we know. And if you are lying in the dark right now, listening to a story about a country whose oldest towns are built on older ground, you are already doing the most important part of the work, which is taking the question seriously enough to sit with it. The question does not resolve tonight. It does not resolve with this account, but it stays with you, like all the best questions do, and it changes what you see when you walk through the older parts of the city tomorrow and the day after that. The concrete is quiet. The thing beneath it is patient. Good night. The question of what was here is, in a certain sense, the oldest question that human beings have ever asked about any particular landscape. Every group that has ever arrived somewhere new has had to reckon with the possibility that the somewhere was not entirely new, that the place had been used and known before. The answer to that question, in the case of Canada, is complicated by the scale of the country, by the diversity of its environments, and by the long history of human presence in North America that is still being reconstructed. In the Laurentian Highlands north of Montreal, where the shield begins to assert itself above the street, Lawrence lowlands and the forest becomes darker and older, and the lakes multiply and the rock faces push through the thin soil. There are places where the rock has been marked, not the petroglyphs of the well-documented sites further west and east, not the obvious ceremonial marks that have attracted attention and protection, smaller things. Lines cut into rock faces in sheltered locations, the kind of sheltered location that would be found by someone moving through the landscape who needed to leave a message or a record or a mark for someone coming after. These marks have been found by hikers and fishermen and cottage owners who have spent enough time in those specific sections of the shield to know which rock faces to look at. Some of them have been reported to the Provincial Archaeology Office. Some of them have been photographed and posted online. Some of them have attracted the attention of researchers who have driven out and looked and gone home thinking about what they saw. And some of them remain in the knowledge of the specific individuals who found them, who have not told anyone because they are not sure who to tell or what telling would accomplish. The marks are not all the same. Some are clearly in the idiom of the shield petroglyph tradition that is well documented at sites like Peterborough and the French River. Some are in idioms that do not fit that tradition comfortably, that are more abstract, that are in locations or at heights that are not consistent with the sites where the Peterborough tradition marks are typically found. Whether these differences reflect different time periods, different cultural traditions, or different functional contexts is a question that would require systematic comparison and analysis, which has not been done because the dataset has not been assembled. The Laurentian Highlands are not an area of concentrated archaeological investigation. They are in the boundary zone between the shield-adapted cultures of the boreal north and the more southern cultures of the Street, Lawrence lowlands, and they have historically fallen between the priorities of the research programs focused on those two areas. The shield marks are known to local people. They have not been comprehensively catalogued. Moving west along the shield into the lake country of northern Ontario, where the waterways of the Quetico Superior Wilderness connect and reconnect across a landscape of bare granite and deep cold lakes, the rock art tradition is better documented. The pictographs of this area, images painted in red ochre on cliff faces at the edges of lakes and rivers, have been studied since the early 20th century and have attracted sustained attention from archaeologists and from the Anishinaabe communities whose traditions they belong to. But the pictographs are not the only marks in the Quetico Superior landscape. There are also things under the water. The lakes of the Quetico are clear enough that features on the lake floors are sometimes visible from canoes, and paddlers who know the territory have been noting what they see for as long as canoe travel in the area has been documented. Some of what they see is natural, fallen trees, rock formations, glacial deposits. Some of what they see is not. A paddler who spent years in the Quetico backcountry and who kept journals of his travels described, in entries spanning the 1980s, seeing features on the floors of 3 different lakes that he characterized as stone arrangements of a kind he could not account for naturally. The journals were donated to a wilderness heritage collection after his death. The specific lakes he named are named in the journals. Whether anyone has dived in those lakes to look at the features is not information available to this account. The Quetico Superior Wilderness, protected since the early 20th century as a wilderness area with restricted development, is in some ways better preserved than comparable shield territory further south. The very restrictions that have kept the development out have also kept the systematic survey out, since the logistics of archaeological fieldwork in a wilderness area with no road access are substantially more demanding than inaccessible terrain. What is in the Quetico lakes and on the Quetico rock faces has been studied in part at the most accessible and most visible sites. The rest waits for the paddlers and the divers and the aerial surveyors and the researchers willing to work in that specific kind of difficult. In Manitoba, the shield country gives way to the plains and then to the boreal forest of the north, and the archaeological record shifts with the ecology. The Churchill River system, which drains much of northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan into Hudson Bay, was a major travel corridor for thousands of years, connecting the interior boreal country to the bay and the coast. The sites along the Churchill are among the most densely documented in the northern boreal region, but the documentation is still sparse compared to what systematic survey would produce. A survey of the Churchill River system conducted in the early 1980s by provincial archaeologists in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan documented a series of campsites, stone caches, Inuksut-type features, and other evidence of sustained use of the corridor. The survey was comprehensive for its time and resources. It produced a baseline dataset that has been used as the foundation for subsequent research in the area. It also, in its final section, noted a category of features that the survey team described as requiring further investigation. Elevated stone arrangements on headlands and ridge ends, overlooking major sections of the river that did not fit the functional categories of the other site types documented in the survey. The survey was explicit about the limitation. The team had documented the existence of these elevated features, but had not had the time or resources to investigate them in the detail needed to characterize them. A follow-up survey was recommended. No record of a follow-up survey has been identified in the literature. The Churchill River flows. The elevated headlands stand. The stone arrangements, if they are still there and still in their original configuration, are still on the ridges overlooking the river. They have been there since whoever placed them, and they have been waiting since the 1980s survey team noted them and moved on, for someone to come back and look more carefully. This is a pattern so consistent across this account that it has become almost formulaic. Features found. Report recommends follow-up. Follow-up does not occur. Features wait. The waiting is not metaphorical. Stone arrangements on headlands above subarctic rivers are not objects that will be found tomorrow and gone the day after. They are features of a stable landscape that will remain largely as they are for a very long time in the absence of deliberate human intervention. They are patient in a way that most archaeological evidence is not. What is impatient is the documentary record around them. The elderly paddler, who knew the lakes where the features were, is gone. The surveyors who noted the Churchill headlands are retired or dead. The farmer near Battleford who kept the log is dead. The materials scientist who found the metallurgical anomalies in the museum copper is presumably still out there somewhere, but his unpublished paper is in whatever files he maintains, and whether he is still interested in pursuing the question is unknown. The human witnesses to these things age and die. The archives they leave behind are less complete than they were. The institutional memory that would be needed to follow up on a 40-year-old survey recommendation gets thinner with each passing year. The case for going back to the Churchill headlands is not stronger in 2024 than it was in 1984. It may be weaker because the specific researchers who made the recommendation are no longer in positions to push for the follow-up. This is the race that the evidence is running, against institutional forgetting, against the attrition of human memory and human attention, against the development pressures that fill in the places where things are waiting to be found, against the accumulation of time that buries the 1,938 conversation and the 1,887 letter and the 1,934 field note under layers of subsequent events and subsequent concerns. The things themselves are patient. The record around them is not. In the end, this account comes back to the question it began with: what is under the concrete? The concrete in the literal sense, on Elgin Street in that Ontario town, and in the broader sense of everything that has been poured over the pre-contact past of this country in the course of building the Canada that currently exists. The buildings and the roads and the railway lines and the farms and the reservoirs and the urban cores of the oldest cities. What is under all of that is the record of thousands of years of human habitation of this landscape, a record that is longer and more complex, and in many places more substantial than the story told in the history books and the heritage plaques and the tourist brochures and the official archaeological syntheses. It is a record that has been glimpsed, repeatedly, by people who were not looking for it and who mostly did not know what to do with what they had found. The record is there, it is waiting. It is patient in the way that stone is patient, and cold water is patient, and dry archive paper is patient. It is not going to do anything different than it has been doing, which is sitting there and waiting for someone to come back with the right question. The right question is simply, what is this? Who made it? When? And why? That question has not been consistently asked. When it has been asked, it has not always been answered. For the institutional and financial and methodological reasons this account has explored. But it is a real question, and it deserves real answers, and the evidence that real answers exist is abundant. The oldest towns in Canada are not sitting on nothing, they are sitting on something. And that something is part of the story of this place, part of the story of the people who have inhabited it, part of the story of what it means for this country to be as old as it actually is, rather than as old as the documents say. Sleep on that, if you can. The ground beneath you has seen things that the history books have not recorded. The landscape around you holds information that the surveys have not collected. The archives, within a day's drive of wherever you are sitting, contain observations that nobody has assembled into a coherent picture. The picture is there to be assembled. It is waiting, like everything else in this account, for someone curious enough and patient enough and supported enough to do the work. The concrete is quiet, the ground beneath it is not. It is full, the way old ground is always full, with the accumulated weight of everything that happened there before the concrete came down. Good night, wherever you are. There is something that happens to a person when they spend enough time with a landscape that they begin to hear it differently. The ordinary view of any given terrain, the view that sees what is currently there and no further, gives way to a layered view, one where the current surface is only the most recent expression of a much longer process. The lake was not always the shape it is. The valley was not always dry. The river did not always run in the channel it runs in now. The hill, the ridge, the peninsula, these are products of forces that worked for much longer than the human presence in the landscape, and the human presence itself has been reshaping them for longer than the written record of that reshaping exists. When you develop this layered view, the landscape stops being a backdrop and starts being an argument. Every feature of it is saying something about what happened here, and the skill of reading it is the skill of hearing what it is saying. The glaciers say what they say through the shape of the hills. The sea says what it says through the distribution of certain sediments and certain fossils. The river says what it says through the shape of the valley it has cut. And the people who were here say what they say through the things they left behind, the things they built and the things they modified and the things they chose and the things they used. Most of us have not developed that layered view of the landscapes we inhabit. We see the surface and we understand it in terms of what is currently there and what it is currently used for. This is practical and appropriate for most purposes, but it means we move through landscapes that are trying to tell us something and we do not hear what they are saying. The people who notice the things this account has been describing, the construction workers who stop their machines, the prospectors who pause in their scramble along cliff faces, the paddlers who look over the side of their canoes into clear cold water, these are people in whom something like the layered view has been briefly activated. They are not archaeologists. They do not have the frameworks to fully interpret what they are seeing, but they are seeing it, for a moment, as something that deserves attention. And they are right. The capacity to notice things that the frameworks do not prepare you for is not rare, it is common. What is less common is the institutional pathway that would allow the noticing to become documentation, and the documentation to become investigation, and the investigation to become understanding. That pathway has too many gaps in it, and things fall through the gaps constantly. The Trent 7 Workstone Channel fell through the gap between construction administration and archaeology. The Georgian Bay pavement fell through the gap between salvage diving and maritime archaeology. The Athabasca stone feature fell through the gap between oil sands monitoring and heritage protection. The Ottawa Valley subsurface features fell through the gap between geological survey and cultural resource management. Each one is a gap that exists, not because someone designed it, but because the systems that manage these different domains were not built to communicate with each other about this specific category of information. Closing those gaps would be the institutional work, and it is not a romantic or a dramatic project. It would involve changing how construction monitoring reports are cross-referenced with archaeology databases. It would involve creating channels through which informal observations from non-archaeologists can reach researchers who know what to do with them. It would involve funding systematic review of archival material, the GSC notes, the CPR construction records, the local historical society collections that nobody has read for this purpose. It would involve resourcing underwater survey programs for the lake floors and coastal zones where features are preserved but unstudied. It would involve creating sustained partnerships with indigenous communities whose oral traditions are the deepest archive of all. None of this requires accepting any specific interpretation of the anomalous features documented in this account. It requires only accepting that the question of what was here is worth asking systematically, rather than asking it accidentally when a construction project happens to find something and then not asking it again until the next accident. The country is old, the ground is old, the things in the ground are old. They do not need to be vindicated. They do not need anyone's permission to be significant. They have been significant since they were built, and they will be significant whether or not anyone investigates them. What needs to happen is simply that the investigation catches up to the significance, that the gap between what the landscape is holding and what we understand about what it is holding gets smaller rather than larger, that the concrete gets poured more carefully and more slowly, and with more attention to what is below it before it goes down. This is not a call for utopia. It is a call for the ordinary practices of attention and care that serious scholarship requires to be applied to a subject that has not received them consistently. The pre-contact past of Canada is a subject that deserves serious scholarship, and it is getting more of it now than it has in the past, and it deserves more still. The journal in the shoebox, if it still exists, has been waiting since 1912 for someone to read it with the right question in mind. The features it describes, if they are still intact under the concrete, have been waiting since they were built, which was quite a long time before 1912. Everything in this account has been waiting. The landscape of Canada is patient. It can afford to be. It has been waiting for the right question for a very long time, and it will wait longer if it needs to. But the question is worth asking now. What is under the concrete? More than anyone has told you, that is enough. That is the beginning of everything. The night is quiet now. The things in the ground are as they have been for a very long time. They will still be there in the morning, patient and present, saying what they have always been saying to anyone who has learned to listen to the language of old ground. Sleep well. The landscape holds what it holds, and it is not going anywhere. Whatever is beneath the oldest towns of Canada has survived a great deal already. It will survive the night, and in the morning maybe someone will go and look. You might be wondering, as you drift towards sleep, why this matters to you specifically. You are not an archaeologist. You are not a government official with the power to allocate survey budgets. You are not an archivist with the authority to organize research programs. You are a person lying somewhere, in a city or a town or a countryside, in this country or in another one, listening to a story about things that are under the ground in the oldest parts of a country that is, in its European and colonial form, only a few hundred years old, but that is, in its actual human history, much older than that. What this has to do with you is not obvious, and it is worth being honest about that. The things under the concrete of Elgin Street are not your direct concern in any immediate practical sense. They were not built for you. Their significance, whatever it turns out to be when someone finally goes to look, will not change your daily life in any direct way. But there is another sense in which the question of what is under the ground of the oldest parts of Canada is deeply relevant to everyone who lives in, or thinks about, or cares about this country. It is relevant because what is under the ground is part of the story of what this place is. And what this place is matters, not in an abstract, nationalistic sense, but in the simple sense that where we are shapes what we are, and the longer the history of where we are, the longer the frame within which our own moment can be understood. The 400 years of Canadian documented history is a very short frame. It places us at the beginning of a story that barely has a plot yet, a colonial project that is still working out its relationship to the land and to the peoples who were here before. The 12,000 years of pre-contact human presence that archaeology has been slowly reconstructing is a much longer frame, and within that frame, the colonial period is a relatively recent disruption of something that had been going on for a very long time. And the suggestion that this account has been exploring, that there may be significantly more to pre-contact Canadian history than the conventional picture describes, extends that frame further still. In the longer frame, this country is a very old place. It has been inhabited by sophisticated, organized, capable people for a very long time. Those people left marks on the landscape that are still there, under the concrete, under the lake, in the archives. The story of what those marks mean is not finished. It is barely started. You are part of that story. Not as a construction worker finding something in a trench, and not as an archaeologist with a survey budget and a research design, but as someone who knows the story is incomplete and thinks that matters. The beginning of any serious engagement with the past of a place is the recognition that the past is there, that it did not disappear when the present arrived, that what is under the concrete is part of the same landscape you are standing on. This country is older than its history. Everything under its oldest towns is part of what it actually is. And what it actually is deserves the careful, sustained, properly supported attention that the scattered observations in this account have been pointing toward for a century and a half of inadvertent discoveries. Sleep well. The ground is there. The things in the ground are there. Morning will come. There is one more thing worth saying before the night closes in entirely. The places in this account, the Georgian Bay channels, and the Trent Severn waterway, and the Cypress Hills, and the Richelieu River, and the Newfoundland interior, and the Ottawa Valley, and the Anticosti Island Plateau, and the Lake Superior North Shore, and the Prairie River crossings, and the oldest downtown blocks of the oldest Canadian cities. These are not remote or inaccessible places. They are places that Canadians drive through, paddle through, fly over, and live near. They are part of the ordinary geography of a country that most of its inhabitants would recognize. The things in these places are not hidden in any dramatic sense. They are not in sealed chambers or underground vaults or inaccessible wilderness. They are in the ground, or in the water, or in the archives, where they have always been. They are waiting not for heroic discovery, but for ordinary attention. The attention of people who ask questions and follow them. The attention of institutions that fund inquiry rather than deferring it. The attention of communities who know things and are given reasons to share what they know. That attention is the only thing that is missing. The evidence is there. The question is whether we are paying attention to it. The night is deep now. The landscape is quiet. Whatever is under the concrete is resting where it rests. It will still be there when the attention comes, if the attention comes. It is patient. It has had a long time to practice patience. Good night. The ground remembers.